Hello, friends. Welcome to Fantasy Realm Reads.
Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, Chapter 16. The Eastern Tunnel. The next day was Tuesday, the 30th of June, and at 6 o'clock in the morning we resumed our journey. We still continued to follow the gallery of lava, a perfect natural pathway, as easy of descent as some of those inclined planes which, in very old German houses, serve the purpose of staircases. This went on until 17 minutes past 12, the precise instant at which we rejoined Hans, who, having been somewhat in advance, had suddenly stopped. "At last," cried my uncle, "we have reached the end of the shaft." I looked wonderingly about me. We were in the center of four-crossed paths, somber and narrow tunnels. The question now arose as to which it was wise to take, and this of itself was no small difficulty. My uncle, who did not wish to appear to have any hesitation about the matter before myself or the guide, at once made up his mind. He pointed quietly to the eastern tunnel, and without delay we entered within its gloomy recesses. Besides, had he entertained any feeling of hesitation, it might have been prolonged indefinitely, for there was no indication by which to determine on a choice. It was absolutely necessary to trust to chance and good fortune. The descent of this obscure and narrow gallery was very gradual and winding. Sometimes we gazed through a succession of arches, its course very like the aisles of a Gothic cathedral. The great artistic sculptors and builders of the Middle Ages might have here completed their studies with advantage. Many most beautiful and suggestive ideas of architectural beauty would have been discovered by them. After passing through this phase of the cavernous way, we suddenly came about a mile farther on upon a square system of arch, adopted by the early Romans, projecting from the solid rock, and keeping up the weight of the roof. Suddenly we would come upon a series of low subterranean tunnels, which looked like beaver holes, or the work of foxes, through whose narrow and winding ways we had literally to crawl. The heat still remained at quite a supportable degree. With an involuntary shudder, I reflected on what the heat must have been when the volcano of Sneffels was pouring its smoke, flames, and streams of boiling lava, all of which must have come up by the road we were now following. I could imagine the torrents of hot seething stone darting on, bubbling up with accompaniments of smoke, steam, and sulphurous stench. Only to think of the consequences, I mused, if the old volcano were once more to set to work. I did not communicate these rather unpleasant reflections to my uncle. He not only would not have understood them, but would have been intensely disgusted. His only idea was to go ahead. He walked, he slid, he clambered over piles of fragments, he rolled down heaps of broken lava, with an earnestness and conviction it was impossible not to admire. At 6 o'clock in the evening, after a very wearisome journey, but one not so fatiguing as before, we had made 6 miles towards the southward, but had not gone more than a mile downwards. My uncle, as usual, gave the signal to halt. We ate our meal in thoughtful silence, and then retired to sleep. Our arrangements for the night were very primitive and simple. A traveling rug, in which each rolled himself, was all our bedding. We had no necessity to fear cold or any unpleasant visit. Travelers who bury themselves in the wilds and depths of the African desert, who seek profit and pleasures in the forests of the New World, are compelled to take it in turn to watch during the hours of sleep. But in this region of the earth absolute solitude and complete security reigned supreme. We had nothing to fear either from savages or from wild beasts. After a night's sweet repose, we awoke fresh and ready for action. There being nothing to detain us, we started on our journey. We continued to burrow through the lava tunnel as before. It was impossible to make out through what soil we were making way. The tunnel, moreover, instead of going down into the bowels of the earth, became absolutely horizontal. I even thought, after some examination, that we were actually tending upwards. About 10 o'clock in the day this state of things became so clear that, finding the change very fatiguing, I was obliged to slacken my pace and finally come to a halt. "Well," said the Professor quickly, "what is the matter?" "The fact is, I am dreadfully tired," was my earnest reply. "What!" cried my uncle, "tired after a 3 hours' walk, and by so easy a road?" "Easy enough, I dare say, but very fatiguing." "But how can that be, when all we have to do is to go downwards?" "I beg your pardon, sir. For some time I have noticed that we are going upwards." "Upwards!" cried my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "How can that be?" "There can be no doubt about it. For the last half hour the slopes have been upward, and if we go on in this way much longer we shall find ourselves back in Iceland." My uncle shook his head with the air of a man who does not want to be convinced. I tried to continue the conversation. He would not answer me, but once more gave the signal for departure. His silence, I thought, was only caused by concentrated ill temper. However this might be, I once more took up my load, and boldly and resolutely followed Hans, who was now in advance of my uncle. I did not like to be beaten or even distanced. I was naturally anxious not to lose sight of my companions. The very idea of being left behind, lost in that terrible labyrinth, made me shiver as with the ague. Besides, if the ascending path was more arduous and painful to clamber, I had one source of secret consolation and delight. It was to all appearance taking us back to the surface of the earth. That of itself was hopeful. Every step I took confirmed me in my belief, and I began already to build castles in the air in relation to my marriage with my pretty little cousin. About 12 o'clock there was a great and sudden change in the aspect of the rocky sides of the gallery. I first noticed it from the diminution of the rays of light which cast back the reflection of the lamp. From being coated with shining and resplendent lava, it became living rock. The sides were sloping walls, which sometimes became quite vertical. We were now in what the geological professors call a state of transition, in the period of Silurian stones, so called because this specimen of early formation is very common in England, in the countries formerly inhabited by the Celtic nation known as Silures. "I can see clearly now," I cried. "The sediment from the waters which once covered the whole earth formed during the second period of its existence these schists and these calcareous rocks. We are turning our backs on the granite rocks, and are like people from Hamburg who would go to Lübeck by way of Hanover." I might just as well have kept my observations to myself. My geological enthusiasm got the better, however, of my cooler judgment, and Professor Hardwigg heard my observations. "What is the matter now?" he said in a tone of great gravity. "Well," cried I, "do you not see these different layers of calcareous rocks, and the first indication of slate strata?" "Well, what then?" "We have arrived at that period of the world's existence when the first plants and the first animals made their appearance." "You think so?" "Yes. Look, examine and judge for yourself." I induced the Professor with some difficulty to cast the light of his lamp on the sides of the long winding gallery. I expected some exclamation to burst from his lips. I was very much mistaken. The worthy Professor never spoke a word. It was impossible to say whether he understood me or not. Perhaps it was possible that in his pride, my uncle and a learned professor, he did not like to own that he was wrong in having chosen the eastern tunnel, or was he determined at any price to go to the end of it? It was quite evident we had left the region of lava. and that the road by which we were going could not take us back to the great crater of Mount Sneffels. As we went along, I could not help ruminating on the whole question, and asked myself if I did not lay too great a stress on these sudden and peculiar modifications of the earth's crust. After all, I was very likely to be mistaken, and it was within the range of probability and possibility that we were not making our way through the strata of rocks which I believed I recognized piled on the lower layer of granitic formation. At all events, if I am right, I thought to myself, I must certainly find some remains of primitive plants, and it will be absolutely necessary to give way to such indubitable evidence. Let us have a good search. I accordingly lost no opportunity of searching, and had not gone more than about 100 yards, when the evidence I sought for cropped up in the most incontestable manner before my eyes. It was quite natural that I should expect to find these signs, for during the Silurian period the seas contained no fewer than 1,500 different animal and vegetable species. My feet, so long accustomed to the hard and arid lava soil, suddenly found themselves treading on a kind of soft dust, the remains of plants and shells. Upon the walls themselves I could clearly make out the outline, as plain as a sun picture, of the fucus and the lycopods. The worthy and excellent Professor Hartwig could not, of course, make any mistake about the matter, but I believe he deliberately closed his eyes and continued on his way with a firm and unalterable step. I began to think that he was carrying his obstinacy a great deal too far. I could no longer act with prudence or composure. I stooped on a sudden and picked up an almost perfect shell, which had undoubtedly belonged to some animal very much resembling some of the present day. Having secured the prize, I followed in the wake of my uncle. "Do you see this?" I said. "Well," said the Professor with the most imperturbable tranquillity, "it is the shell of a crustaceous animal of the extinct order of the trilobites, nothing more, I assure you." "But," cried I, much troubled at his coolness, "do you not draw any conclusion from it?" "Well, if I may ask, what conclusion do you draw from it yourself?"
"Well, I thought—"
"I know, my boy, what you would say, and you are right, perfectly and incontestably right. We have finally abandoned the crust of lava, and the road by which the lava ascended. It is quite possible that I may have been mistaken, but I shall be unable to discover my error until I get to the end of this gallery." "You are quite right as far as that is concerned," I replied, "and I should highly approve of your decision if we had not to fear the greatest of all dangers." "And what is that?"
"Want of water."
"Well, my dear Henry, it can't be helped. We must put ourselves on rations."
And on he went.
End of chapter 16, read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 17. Deeper and Deeper, the Coal Mine. In truth, we were compelled to put ourselves upon rations. Our supply would certainly last no more than 3 days. I found this out about supper time. The worst part of the matter was that in what is called the transition rocks it was hardly to be expected we should meet with water. I had read of the horrors of thirst, and I knew that where we were, a brief trial of its sufferings would put an end to our adventures and our lives. But it was utterly useless to discuss the matter with my uncle. He would have answered by some axiom from Plato. During the whole of next day we proceeded on our journey through this interminable gallery, arch after arch, tunnel after tunnel. We journeyed without exchanging a word. We had become as mute and reticent as Hans, our guide. The road had no longer an upward tendency. At all events, if it had, it was not to be made out very clearly. Sometimes there could be no doubt that we were going downwards, but this inclination was scarcely to be distinguished, and was by no means reassuring to the Professor, because the character of the strata was in no wise modified, and the transition character of the rocks became more and more marked. It was a glorious sight to see how the electric light brought out the sparkles in the walls of the calcareous rocks and the old red sandstone. One might have fancied oneself in one of those deep cuttings in Devonshire, which have given their name to this kind of soil. Some magnificent specimens of marble projected from the sides of the gallery, some of an agate grey with white veins of variegated character, others of a yellow spotted colour with red veins. Farther off might be seen samples of colour in which cherry tinted seams were to be found in all their brightest shades. The greater number of these marbles were stamped with the marks of primitive animals. Since the previous evening, nature and creation had made considerable progress. Instead of the rudimentary trilobites, I perceived the remains of a more perfect order. Among others, the fish in which the eye of a geologist has been able to discover the first form of the reptile. The Devonian seas were inhabited by a vast number of animals of this species, which were deposited in tens of thousands in the rocks of new formation. It was quite evident to me that we were ascending the scale of animal life of which man forms the summit. My excellent uncle, the Professor, appeared not to take notice of these warnings. He was determined at any risk to proceed. He must have been in expectation of one of two things: either that a vertical well was about to open under his feet, and thus allow him to continue his descent, or that some insurmountable obstacle would compel us to stop and go back by the road we had so long travelled. But evening came again, and to my horror neither hope was doomed to be realized. On Friday, after a night when I began to feel the gnawing agony of thirst, and when in consequence appetite decreased, our little band rose and once more followed the turnings and windings, the ascents and descents of this interminable gallery. All were silent and gloomy. I could see that even my uncle had ventured too far. After about 10 hours of further progress, a progress dull and monotonous to the last degree, I remarked that the reverberation and reflection of our lamps upon the sides of the tunnel had singularly diminished. The marble, the schist, the calcareous rocks, the red sandstone had disappeared, leaving in their places a dark and gloomy wall, sombre and without brightness. When we reached a remarkably narrow part of the tunnel, I leaned my left hand against the rock. When I took my hand away and happened to glance at it, it was quite black. We had reached the coal strata of the central earth. "A coal mine!" I cried. "A coal mine without miners," responded my uncle a little severely. "How can we tell?" "I can tell," replied my uncle in a sharp and doctorial tone. "I am perfectly certain that this gallery, through successive layers of coal, was not cut by the hand of man. But whether it is the work of nature or not is of little concern to us. The hour for our evening meal has come. Let us sup." Hans, the guide, occupied himself in preparing food. I had come to that point when I could no longer eat. All I cared about were the few drops of water which fell to my share. What I suffered it is useless to record. The guide's gourd, not quite half full, was all that was left for us three. Having finished their repast, my two companions laid themselves down upon their rugs, and found in sleep a remedy for their fatigue and sufferings. As for me, I could not sleep. I lay counting the hours until morning. The next morning, Saturday, at 6 o'clock, we started again. 20 minutes later, we suddenly came upon a vast excavation. From its mighty extent, I saw at once that the hand of man could have had nothing to do with this coal mine. The vault above would have fallen in. As it was only held together by some miracle of nature. This mighty natural cavern was about 100 feet wide, by about 150 high. The earth had evidently been cast apart by some violent subterranean commotion. The mass, giving way to some prodigious upheaving of nature, had split in two, leaving the vast gap into which we inhabitants of the earth had penetrated for the first time. The whole singular history of the coal period was written on those dark and gloomy walls. A geologist would have been able easily to follow the different phases of its formation. The seams of coal were separated by strata of sandstone, a compact clay which appeared to be crushed down by the weight from above. At that period of the world which preceded the secondary epoch, the earth was covered by a coating of enormous and rich vegetation, due to the double action of tropical heat and perpetual humidity. A vast atmospheric cloud of vapor surrounded the earth on all sides, preventing the rays of the sun from ever reaching it. Hence the conclusion that these intense heats did not arise from this new source of caloric. Perhaps even the star of day was not quite ready for its brilliant work to illumine a universe. Climates did not as yet exist, and a level heat pervaded the whole surface of the globe, the same heat existing at the North Pole as at the equator. Whence did it come? From the interior of the earth? In spite of all the learned theories of Professor Hartwig, a fierce and vehement fire certainly burned within the entrails of the great spheroid. Its action was felt even to the very topmost crust of the earth. The plants then in existence, being deprived of the vivifying rays of the sun, had neither buds, nor flowers, nor odor, but their roots drew a strong and vigorous life from the burning earth of early days. There were but few of what may be called trees, only herbaceous plants, immense turfs, briers, mosses, rare families, which, however, in those days were counted by tens and tens of thousands. It is entirely to this exuberant vegetation that coal owes its origin. The crust of the vast globe still yielded under the influence of the seething, boiling mass which was forever at work beneath. Hence arose numerous fissures and continual falling in of the upper earth. The dense mass of plants, being beneath the waters, soon formed themselves into vast agglomerations. Then came about the action of natural chemistry. In the depths of the ocean, the vegetable mass at first became turf. Then, thanks to the influence of gases and subterranean fermentation, they underwent the complete process of mineralization. In this manner, in early days, were formed those vast and prodigious layers of coal, which an ever increasing consumption must utterly use up in about 3 centuries more, if people do not find some more economic light than gas, and some cheaper motive power than steam. All these reflections, the memories of my school studies, came to my mind while I gazed upon these mighty accumulations of coal, whose riches, however, are scarcely likely to be ever utilized. The working of these mines could only be carried out at an expense that would never yield a profit. The matter, however, is scarcely worthy consideration when coal is scattered over the whole surface of the globe, within a few yards of the upper crust. As I looked at these untouched strata, therefore, I knew they would remain as long as the world lasts. While we still continued our journey, I alone forgot the length of the road by giving myself up wholly to these geological considerations. The temperature continued to be very much the same as while we were traveling amid the lava and the schists. On the other hand, my sense of smell was much affected by a very powerful odor. I immediately knew that the gallery was filled to overflowing with that dangerous gas the miners call fire damp, the explosion of which has caused such fearful and terrible accidents, making 100 widows and hundreds of orphans in a single hour. Happily, we were able to illumine our progress by means of the Ruhmkorff apparatus. If we had been so rash and imprudent as to explore this gallery, torch in hand, a terrible explosion would have put an end to our travels, simply because no travelers would be left. Our excursion through this wondrous coal mine in the very bowels of the earth lasted until evening. My uncle was scarcely able to conceal his impatience and dissatisfaction at the road continuing still to advance in a horizontal direction. The darkness, dense and opaque, a few yards in advance and in the rear, rendered it impossible to make out what was the length of the gallery. For myself, I began to believe that it was simply interminable, and would go on in the same manner for months. Suddenly, at 6 o'clock, we stood in front of a wall. To the right, to the left, above, below, nowhere was there any passage. We had reached a spot where the rocks said in unmistakable accents, "No thoroughfare." I stood stupefied. The guide simply folded his arms. My uncle was silent.
Well, well, so much the better, cried my uncle at last. I now know what we are about. We are decidedly not upon the road followed by Saknussemm. All we have to do is to go back. Let us take one night's good rest, and before 3 days are over, I promise you we shall have regained the point where the galleries divided.
Yes, we may, if our strength lasts as long, I cried in a lamentable voice.
And why not?
Tomorrow, among us three, there will not be a drop of water. It is just gone.
And your courage with it,
said my uncle, speaking in a severe tone. What could I say? I turned round on my side, and from sheer exhaustion fell into a heavy sleep, disturbed by dreams of water. And I awoke unrefreshed. I would have bartered a diamond mine for a glass of pure spring water. End of chapter 17. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 18. The Wrong Road. Next day our departure took place at a very early hour. There was no time for the least delay. According to my account, we had 5 days' hard work to get back to the place where the galleries divided. I can never tell all the sufferings we endured upon our return. My uncle bore them like a man who has been in the wrong, that is, with concentrated and suppressed anger. Hans with all the resignation of his pacific character, and I confess that I did nothing but complain and despair. I had no heart for this bad fortune. But there was one consolation. Defeat at the outset would probably upset the whole journey. As I had expected from the first, our supply of water gave completely out on our first day's march. Our provision of liquids was reduced to our supply of Schiedam, but this horrible, nay, I will say it, this infernal liquor burnt the throat, and I could not even bear the sight of it. I found the temperature to be stifling. I was paralyzed with fatigue. More than once I was about to fall insensible to the ground. The whole party then halted, and the worthy Icelander and my excellent uncle did their best to console and comfort me. I could, however, plainly see that my uncle was contending painfully against the extreme fatigues of our journey, and the awful torture generated by the absence of water. At length a time came when I ceased to recollect anything, when all was one awful, hideous, fantastic dream. At last, on Tuesday, the 7th of the month of July, after crawling on our hands and knees for many hours, more dead than alive, we reached the point of junction between the galleries. I lay like a log, an inert mass of human flesh, on the arid lava soil. It was then 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, leaning against the wall, tried to nibble away at some pieces of biscuit, while deep groans and sighs escaped from my scorched and swollen lips. Then I fell off into a kind of deep lethargy. Presently I felt my uncle approach and lift me up tenderly in his arms.
"Poor boy,"
I heard him say in a tone of deep commiseration. I was profoundly touched by these words, being by no means accustomed to signs of womanly weakness in the professor. I caught his trembling hands in mine and gave them a gentle pressure. He allowed me to do so without resistance, looking at me kindly all the time. His eyes were wet with tears. I then saw him take the gourd which he wore at his side. To my surprise, or rather to my stupefaction, he placed it to my lips.
"Drink, my boy," he said.
Was it possible my ears had not deceived me? Was my uncle mad? I looked at him with, I am sure, quite an idiotic expression. I could not believe him. I too much feared the counteraction of disappointment.
"Drink," he said again.
Had I heard aright? Before, however, I could ask myself the question a second time, a mouthful of water cooled my parched lips and throat. One mouthful, but I do believe it brought me back to life. I thanked my uncle by clasping my hands. My heart was too full to speak.
"Yes," said he, "one mouthful of water, the very last. Do you hear, my boy? The very last. I have taken care of it at the bottom of my bottle, as the apple of my eyes. 20 times, 100 times, I have resisted the fearful desire to drink it. But no, Harry, I saved it for you."
My dear uncle, I exclaimed, and the big tears rolled down my hot and feverish cheeks.
"Yes, my poor boy. I knew that when you reached this place, this crossroad in the earth, you would fall down half dead, and I saved my last drop of water in order to restore you."
"Thanks," I cried, "thanks from my heart." As little as my thirst was really quenched, I had nevertheless partially recovered my strength. The contracted muscles of my throat relaxed, and the inflammation of my lips in some measure subsided. At all events, I was able to speak. "Well," I said, "there can be no doubt as to what we have to do. Water has utterly failed us. Our journey is therefore at an end. Let us return." While I spoke thus, my uncle evidently avoided my face. He held down his head, his eyes were turned in every possible direction but the right one. "Yes," I continued, getting excited by my own words, "we must go back to Sneffels. May Heaven give us strength to enable us once more to revisit the light of day. Would that we now stood on the summit of the crater."
"Go back," said my uncle, speaking to himself, "and must it be so?"
"Go back, yes, and without losing a single moment," I vehemently cried. For some moments there was silence under that dark and gloomy vault.
"So, my dear Harry," said the professor in a very singular tone of voice, "those few drops of water have not sufficed to restore your energy and courage."
"Courage!" I cried.
"I see that you are quite as downcast as before, and still give way to discouragement and despair."
What then was the man made of, and what other projects were entering his fertile and audacious brain? "You are not discouraged, sir?"
"What? Give up just as we are on the verge of success?"
he cried.
"Never, never shall it be said that Professor Hartwig retreated."
then we must make up our minds to perish," I cried with a helpless sigh.
No, Harry, my boy, certainly not. Go, leave me. I am very far from desiring your death. Take Hans with you. I will go on alone.
"You ask us to leave you?"
Leave me, I say. I have undertaken this dangerous and perilous adventure. I will carry it to the end, or I will never return to the surface of Mother Earth. Go, Harry. Once more I say to you, go.
My uncle, as he spoke, was terribly excited. His voice, which before had been tender, almost womanly, became harsh and menacing. He appeared to be struggling with desperate energy against the impossible. I did not wish to abandon him at the bottom of that abyss, while, on the other hand, the instinct of preservation told me to fly. Meanwhile, our guide was looking on with profound calmness and indifference. He appeared to be an unconcerned party, and yet he perfectly well knew what was going on between us. Our gestures sufficiently indicated the different roads each wished to follow, and which each tried to influence the other to undertake. But Hans appeared not to take the slightest interest in what was really a question of life and death for us all, but waited quite ready to obey the signal which should say go aloft, or to resume his desperate journey into the interior of the earth. How then I wished with all my heart and soul that I could make him understand my words. My representations, my sighs and groans, the earnest accents in which I should have spoken, would have convinced that cold, hard nature. Those fearful dangers and perils of which the stolid guide had no idea. I would have pointed them out to him. I would have, as it were, made him see and feel. Between us we might have convinced the obstinate professor. If the worst had come to the worst, we could have compelled him to return to the summit of Sneffels. I quietly approached Hans. I caught his hand in mine. He never moved a muscle. I indicated to him the road to the top of the crater. He remained motionless. My panting form, my haggard countenance, must have indicated the extent of my sufferings. The Icelander gently shook his head and pointed to my uncle. "Master," he said. The word is Icelandic as well as English. "The master!" I cried beside myself with fury. "Madman! No, I tell you he is not the master of our lives. We must fly. We must drag him with us. Do you hear me? Do you understand me? I say." I have already explained that I held Hans by the arm. I tried to make him rise from his seat. I struggled with him and tried to force him away. My uncle now interposed.
My good Henry, be calm, he said. You will obtain nothing from my devoted follower, therefore listen to what I have to say.
I folded my arms as well as I could, and looked at my uncle full in the face.
This wretched want of water, he said, is the sole obstacle to the success of my project. In the entire gallery, made of lava, schist, and coal, it is true we found not one liquid molecule. It is quite possible that we may be more fortunate in the western tunnel.
My sole reply was to shake my head with an air of deep incredulity.
Listen to me to the end, said the professor in his well-known lecturing voice. While you lay yonder without life or motion, I undertook a reconnoitring journey into the conformation of this other gallery. I have discovered that it goes directly downwards into the bowels of the earth, and in a few hours will take us to the old granitic formation. In this we shall undoubtedly find innumerable springs. The nature of the rock makes this a mathematical certainty, and instinct agrees with logic to say that it is so. Now this is the serious proposition which I have to make to you. When Christopher Columbus asked of his men 3 days to discover the land of promise, his men, ill, terrified, and hopeless, yet gave him 3 days, and the new world was discovered. Now I, the Christopher Columbus of this subterranean region, only ask of you 1 more day. If, when that time is expired, I have not found the water of which we are in search, I swear to you, I will give up my mighty enterprise and return to the earth's surface." Despite my irritation and despair, I knew how much it cost my uncle to make this proposition, and to hold such conciliatory language. Under the circumstances, what could I do but yield? "Well," I cried, "let it be as you wish, and may Heaven reward your superhuman energy. But as, unless we discover water, our hours are numbered, let us lose no time, but go ahead." End of chapter 18. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 19. The Western Gallery. A New Route. Our descent was now resumed by means of the second gallery. Hans took up his post in front as usual. We had not gone more than 100 yards when the Professor carefully examined the walls. "This is the primitive formation. We are on the right road. Onwards is our hope." When the whole earth got cool in the first hours of the world's morning, the diminution of the volume of the earth produced a state of dislocation in its upper crust, followed by ruptures, crevices, and fissures. The passage was a fissure of this kind, through which, ages ago, had flowed the eruptive granite. The thousand windings and turnings formed an inextricable labyrinth through the ancient soil. As we descended, successions of layers composing the primitive soil appeared with the utmost fidelity of detail. Geological science considers this primitive soil as the base of the mineral crust, and it has recognized that it is composed of 3 different strata or layers, all resting on the immovable rock known as granite. No mineralogists had even found themselves placed in such a marvelous position to study nature in all her real and naked beauty. The sounding rod, a mere machine, could not bring to the surface of the earth the objects of value for the study of its internal structure, which we were about to see with our own eyes, to touch with our own hands. Remember that I am writing this after the journey. Across the streak of the rocks, colored by beautiful green tints, wound metallic threads of copper, of manganese, with traces of platinum and gold. I could not help gazing at these riches buried in the entrails of Mother Earth, and of which no man would have the enjoyment to the end of time. These treasures, mighty and inexhaustible, were buried in the morning of the earth's history at such awful depths that no crowbar or pickaxe will ever drag them from their tomb. The light of our Ruhmkorff's coil, increased tenfold by the myriad of prismatic masses of rock, sent its jets of fire in every direction, and I could fancy myself traveling through a huge hollow diamond, the rays of which produced myriads of extraordinary effects. Towards 6 o'clock this festival of light began sensibly and visibly to decrease, and soon almost ceased. The sides of the gallery assumed a crystallized tint with a somber hue. White mica began to commingle more freely with feldspar and quartz, to form what may be called the true rock, the stone which is hard above all, that supports without being crushed the 4 stories of the earth's soil. We were walled by an immense prison of granite. It was now 8 o'clock, and still there was no sign of water. The sufferings I endured were horrible. My uncle now kept at the head of our little column. Nothing could induce him to stop. I, meanwhile, had but one real thought. My ear was keenly on the watch to catch the sound of a spring. But no pleasant sound of falling water fell upon my listening ear.
But at last the time came when my limbs refused to carry me longer. I contended heroically against the terrible tortures I endured, because I did not wish to compel my uncle to halt. To him I knew this would be the last fatal stroke. Suddenly I felt a deadly faintness come over me. My eyes could no longer see, my knees shook. I gave one despairing cry and fell. "Help! Help! I am dying!" My uncle turned and slowly retraced his steps. He looked at me with folded arms, and then allowed one sentence to escape in hollow accents from his lips. "All is over." The last thing I saw was a face fearfully distorted with pain and sorrow, and then my eyes closed. When I again opened them, I saw my companions lying near me, motionless, wrapped in their huge traveling rugs. Were they asleep or dead? For myself, sleep was wholly out of the question. My fainting fit over, I was wakeful as the lark. I suffered too much for sleep to visit my eyelids, the more that I thought myself sick unto death, dying. The last words spoken by my uncle seemed to be buzzing in my ears. All is over. And it was probable that he was right. In the state of prostration to which I was reduced, it was madness to think of ever again seeing the light of day. Above were miles upon miles of the earth's crust. As I thought of it, I could fancy the whole weight resting on my shoulders. I was crushed, annihilated, and exhausted myself in vain attempts to turn in my granite bed. Hours upon hours passed away. A profound and terrible silence reigned around us, a silence of the tomb. Nothing could make itself heard through these gigantic walls of granite. The very thought was stupendous. Presently, despite my apathy, despite the kind of deadly calm into which I was cast, something aroused me. It was a slight but peculiar noise. While I was watching intently, I observed that the tunnel was becoming dark. Then, gazing through the dim light that remained, I thought I saw the Icelander taking his departure, lamp in hand. Why had he acted thus? Did Hans the guide mean to abandon us? My uncle lay fast asleep, or dead. I tried to cry out and arouse him. My voice, feebly issuing from my parched and fevered lips, found no echo in that fearful place. My throat was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. The obscurity had by this time become intense, and at last even the faint sound of the guide's footsteps was lost in the blank distance. My soul seemed filled with anguish, and death appeared welcome. Only let it come quickly. "Hans is leaving us," I cried. "Hans, Hans, if you are a man, come back." These words were spoken to myself. They could not be heard aloud. Nevertheless, after the first moments of terror were over, I was ashamed of my suspicions against a man who hitherto had behaved so admirably. Nothing in his conduct or character justified suspicion. Moreover, a moment's reflection reassured me. His departure could not be a flight. Instead of ascending the gallery, he was going deeper down into the gulf. Had he had any bad design, his way would have been upwards. This reasoning calmed me a little, and I began to hope. The good and peaceful and imperturbable Hans would certainly not have arisen from his sleep without some serious and grave motive. Was he bent on a voyage of discovery? during the deep, still silence of the night, had he at last heard that sweet murmur about which we were all so anxious. End of chapter 19. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 20. Water, where is it? A bitter disappointment. During a long, weary hour, there crossed my wildly delirious brain all sorts of reasons as to what could have aroused our quiet and faithful guide. The most absurd and ridiculous ideas passed through my head, each more impossible than the other. I believe I was either half or wholly mad. Suddenly, however, there arose, as it were from the depths of the earth, a voice of comfort. It was the sound of footsteps. Hans was returning. Presently, the uncertain light began to shine upon the walls of the passage, and then it came in view far down the sloping tunnel. At length, Hans himself appeared. He approached my uncle, placed his hand upon his shoulder, and gently awakened him. My uncle, as soon as he saw who it was, instantly arose. "Well!" exclaimed the professor. "Vatten," said the hunter. I did not know a single word of the Danish language, and yet by a sort of mysterious instinct I understood what the guide had said. "Water! Water!" I cried, in a wild and frantic tone, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a madman. "Water," murmured my uncle in a voice of deep emotion and gratitude. "Var? Where?" "Nedet. Below." Where? Below. I understood every word. I had caught the hunter by the hands, and I shook them heartily, while he looked on with perfect calmness. The preparations for our departure did not take long, and we were soon making a rapid descent into the tunnel. An hour later we had advanced 1,000 yards and descended 2,000 feet. At this moment I heard an accustomed and well-known sound running along the floors of the granite rock, a kind of dull and sullen roar, like that of a distant waterfall. During the first half hour of our advance, not finding the discovered spring, my feelings of intense suffering appeared to return. Once more I began to lose all hope. My uncle, however, observing how downhearted I was again becoming, took up the conversation. "Hans was right," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "That is the dull roaring of a torrent." "A torrent!" I cried, delighted at even hearing the welcome words. "There's not the slightest doubt about it," he replied. "A subterranean river is flowing beside us." I made no reply, but hastened on, once more animated by hope. I began not even to feel the deep fatigue which hitherto had overpowered me. The very sound of this glorious murmuring water already refreshed me. We could hear it increasing in volume every moment. The torrent, which for a long time could be heard flowing over our heads, now ran distinctly along the left wall, roaring, rushing, spluttering, and still falling. Several times I passed my hand across the rock, hoping to find some trace of humidity, of the slightest percolation. Alas, in vain. Again a half hour passed in the same weary toil. Again we advanced. It now became evident that the hunter, during his absence, had not been able to carry his researches any farther. Guided by an instinct peculiar to the dwellers in mountain regions and water-finders, he smelt the living spring through the rock. Still, he had not seen the precious liquid. He had neither quenched his own thirst nor brought us one drop in his gourd. Moreover, we soon made the disastrous discovery that, if our progress continued, we should soon be moving away from the torrent, the sound of which gradually diminished. We turned back. Hans halted at the precise spot where the sound of the torrent appeared nearest. I could bear the suspense and suffering no longer, and I seated myself against the wall, behind which I could hear the water seething and effervescing, not 2 feet away, but a solid wall of granite still separated us from it. Hans looked keenly at me, and strange enough, for once I thought I saw a smile on his imperturbable face. He rose from a stone on which he had been seated, and took up the lamp. I could not help rising and following. He moved slowly along the firm and solid granite wall. I watched him with mingled curiosity and eagerness. Presently he halted and placed his ear against the dry stone, moving slowly along and listening with the most extreme care and attention. I understood at once that he was searching for the exact spot where the torrent's roar was most plainly heard. This point he soon found in the lateral wall on the left side, about 3 feet above the level of the tunnel floor. I was in a state of intense excitement. I scarcely dared believe what the eider duck hunter was about to do. It was, however, impossible in a moment more not to both understand and applaud and even smother him in my embraces when I saw him raise the heavy crowbar and commence an attack upon the rock itself. "Saved!" I cried. "Yes," cried my uncle, even more excited and delighted than myself. "Hans is quite right. Oh, the worthy, excellent man! We should never have thought of such an idea." And nobody else, I think, would have done so. Such a process, simple as it seemed, would most certainly not have entered our heads. Nothing could be more dangerous than to begin to work with pickaxes in that particular part of the globe. Supposing, while he was at work, a breakup were to take place, and supposing the torrent, once having gained an inch, were to take an ell, and come pouring bodily through the broken rock. Not one of these dangers was chimerical. They were only too real. But at that moment, no fear of falling in of the roof, or even of inundation, was capable of stopping us. Our thirst was so intense that to quench it we would have dug below the bed of the old ocean itself. Hans went quietly to work, a work which neither my uncle nor I would have undertaken at any price. Our impatience was so great that if we had once begun with pickaxe and crowbar, the rock would have soon split into 100 fragments. The guide, on the contrary, calm, ready, moderate, wore away at the hard rock by little steady blows of his instrument, making no attempt at a larger hole than about 6 inches. As I stood, I heard, or I thought I heard, the roar of the torrent momentarily increasing in loudness, and at times I almost felt the pleasant sensation of water upon my parched lips. At the end of what appeared an age, Hans had made a hole which enabled his crowbar to enter 2 feet into the solid rock. He had been at work exactly an hour. It appeared a dozen. I was getting wild with impatience. My uncle began to think of using more violent measures. I had the greatest difficulty in checking him. He had indeed just got hold of his crowbar when a loud and welcome hiss was heard. Then a stream, or rather jet, of water burst through the wall and came out with such force as to hit the opposite side. Hans, the guide, who was half upset by the shock, was scarcely able to keep down a cry of pain and grief. I understood his meaning when, plunging my hands into the sparkling jet, I myself gave a wild and frantic cry. The water was scalding hot. "Boiling!" I cried in bitter disappointment. Well, never mind, said my uncle. It will soon get cool. The tunnel began to be filled by clouds of vapor, while a small stream ran away into the interior of the earth. In a short time we had some sufficiently cool to drink. We swallowed it in huge mouthfuls. Oh, what exalted delight! What rich and incomparable luxury! What was this water? Whence did it come? To us, what was that? The simple fact was, it was water, and though still with a tingle of warmth about it, it brought back to the heart that life which, but for it, must surely have faded away. I drank greedily, almost without tasting it. When, however, I had almost quenched my ravenous thirst, I made a discovery. Why, it is chalybeate water. A most excellent stomachic, replied my uncle, and highly mineralized. Here is a journey worth 20 to Spa. It's very good, I replied. I should think so. Water found 6 miles underground. There is a peculiarly inky flavor about it, which is by no means disagreeable. Hans may congratulate himself on having made a rare discovery. What do you say, nephew, according to the usual custom of travelers, to name the stream after him? Good, said I, and the name of Hansbach, that is Hans Brook, was at once agreed upon. Hans was not a bit more proud after hearing our determination than he was before. After having taken a very small modicum of the welcome refreshment, he had seated himself in a corner with his usual imperturbable gravity. Now, said I, it is not worth while letting this water run to waste. What is the use? Replied my uncle. The source from which this river rises is inexhaustible. Never mind, I continued. Let us fill our goat skin and gourds, and then try to stop the opening up. My advice, after some hesitation, was followed, or attempted to be followed. Hans picked up all the broken pieces of granite he had knocked out, and using some tow he happened to have about him, tried to shut up the fissure he had made in the wall. All he did was to scald his hands. The pressure was too great, and all our attempts were utter failures. It is evident, I remarked, that the upper surface of these springs is situated at a very great height above, as we may fairly infer from the great pressure of the jet. That is by no means doubtful, replied my uncle. If this column of water is about 32,000 feet high, the atmospheric pressure must be something enormous. But a new idea has just struck me. And what is that? Why be at so much trouble to close this aperture? Because... I hesitated and stammered, having no real reason. When our water bottles are empty, we are not at all sure that we shall be able to fill them, observed my uncle. I think that is very probable. Well, then, let this water run. It will, of course, naturally follow in our track, and will serve to guide and refresh us. I think the idea a good one, I cried in reply, and with this rivulet as a companion, there is no further reason why we should not succeed in our marvelous project. Ah, my boy, said the professor, laughing, after all you are coming around. More than that, I am now confident of ultimate success. One moment, nephew mine. Let us begin by taking some hours of repose. I had utterly forgotten that it was night. The chronometer, however, informed me of the fact. Soon we were sufficiently restored and refreshed, and had all fallen into a profound sleep. End of chapter 20 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Recorded by Dave K. Chapter 21. Under the Ocean. By the next day we had nearly forgotten all our past sufferings. The first sensation I had experienced was surprise at not being thirsty, and I actually asked myself the reason. The running stream, which flowed in rippling wavelets at my feet, was the satisfactory reply. We breakfasted with a good appetite, and then drank our fill of the excellent water. I felt myself quite a new man, ready to go anywhere my uncle chose to lead. I began to think. Why should not a man as seriously convinced as my uncle succeed, with so excellent a guide as worthy Hans, and so devoted a nephew as myself? These were the brilliant ideas which now invaded my brain. Had the proposition now been made to go back to the summit of Mount Sneffels, I should have declined the offer in a most indignant manner. But fortunately there was no question of going up. We are about to descend farther into the interior of the earth. "Let us be moving," I cried, awakening the echoes of the old world. We resumed our march on Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. The great granite tunnel, as it went round by sinuous and winding ways, presented every now and then sharp turns, and in fact all the appearance of a labyrinth. Its direction, however, was in general toward the southwest. My uncle made several pauses in order to consult his compass. The gallery now began to trend downwards in a horizontal direction, with about 2 inches of fall in every furlong. The murmuring stream flowed quietly at our feet. I could not but compare it to some familiar spirit guiding us through the earth, and I dabbled my fingers in its tepid water, which sang like a naiad as we progressed. My good humor began to assume a mythological character. As for my uncle, he began to complain of the horizontal character of the road. His route, he found, began to be indefinitely prolonged, instead of sliding down the celestial ray, according to his expression. But we had no choice, and as long as our road led toward the center, however little progress we made, there was no reason to complain. Moreover, from time to time the slopes were much greater. The naiad sang more loudly, and we began to dip downward in earnest. As yet, however, I felt no painful sensation. I had not got over the excitement of the discovery of water. That day and the next we did a considerable amount of horizontal, and relatively little vertical, traveling. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our estimation, we ought to have been 30 leagues to the southeast of Reykjavik, and about 2 leagues and a half deep. We now received a rather startling surprise. Under our feet there opened a horrible well. My uncle was so delighted that he actually clapped his hands as he saw how steep and sharp was the descent. "Ah, ah!" he cried in rapturous delight. "This takes us a long way. Look at the projections of the rock. Ha!" he claimed. "It's a fearful staircase." Hans, however, who in all our troubles had never given up the ropes, took care so to dispose of them as to prevent any accidents. Our descent then began. I dare not call it a perilous descent, for I was already too familiar with that sort of work to look upon it as anything but a very ordinary affair. This well was a kind of narrow opening in the massive granite of the kind known as a fissure. The contraction of the terrestrial scaffolding, when it suddenly cooled, had been evidently the cause. If it had ever served in former times as a kind of funnel through which passed the eruptive masses vomited by Sneffels, I was at a loss to explain how it had left no mark. We were, in fact, descending in a spiral, something like those winding staircases in use in modern homes. We were compelled every quarter of an hour, or thereabouts, to sit down in order to rest our legs. Our calves ached. We then seated ourselves on some projecting rock with our legs hanging over, and gossiped while we ate a mouthful, drinking still from the pleasantly warm running stream which had not deserted us. It is scarcely necessary to say that in this curiously shaped fissure the Hansbach had become a cascade, to the detriment of its size. It was still, however, sufficient and more for our wants. Besides, we knew that, as soon as the declivity ceased to be so abrupt, the stream must resume its peaceful course. At this moment it reminded me of my uncle, his impatience and rage, while when it flowed more peacefully I pictured to myself the placidity of the Icelandic guide. During the whole of 2 days, the 6th and 7th of July, we followed the extraordinary spiral staircase of the fissure, penetrating 2 leagues farther into the crust of the earth, which put us 5 leagues below the level of the sea. On the 8th, however, at 12 o'clock in the day, the fissure suddenly assumed a much more gentle slope, still trending in a southeast direction. The road now became comparatively easy, and at the same time dreadfully monotonous. It would have been difficult for matters to have turned out otherwise. Our peculiar journey had no chance of being diversified by landscape and scenery. At all events, such was my idea. At length, on Wednesday the 15th, we were actually 7 leagues, 21 miles, below the surface of the earth, and 50 leagues distant from the mountain of Snæfell's, though, if the truth be told, we were very tired. Our health had resisted all suffering, and was in a most satisfactory state. Our traveller's box of medicaments had not even been opened. My uncle was careful to note every hour the indications of the compass, of the manometer, and of the thermometer, all of which he afterwards published in his elaborate philosophical and scientific account of our remarkable voyage. He was therefore able to give an exact relation of the situation. When, therefore, he informed me that we were 50 leagues in a horizontal direction distant from our starting point, I could not suppress a loud exclamation. "What is the matter now?" cried my uncle. "Nothing very important. Only an idea has entered my head," was my reply. "Well, out with it, my boy." "It is my opinion that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "We can very easily find out," I replied, pulling out a map and compasses. "You see," I said, after careful measurement, "that I am not mistaken. We are far beyond Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues to the southeast will take us into the open sea." "Under the open sea!" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands with a delighted air. "Yes," I cried, "no doubt old ocean flows over our heads." "Well, my dear boy, what can be more natural? Do you not know that in the neighborhood of Newcastle there are coal mines which have been worked far out under the sea?" Now my worthy uncle, the professor, no doubt regarded this discovery as a very simple fact, but to me the idea was by no means a pleasant one. And yet, when one came to think the matter over seriously, what mattered it whether the plains and mountains of Iceland were suspended over our devoted heads, or the mighty billows of the Atlantic Ocean? The whole question rested on the solidity of the granite roof above us. However, I soon got used to the ideal, for the passage, now level, now running down, and still always to the southeast, kept going deeper and deeper into the profound abysses of Mother Earth. 3 days later, on the 18th of July, on a Saturday, we reached a kind of vast grotto. My uncle here paid Hans his usual rix dollars, and it was decided that the next day should be a day of rest. End of chapter.
Chapter 22. Sunday, Below Ground. I awoke on Sunday morning without any sense of hurry and bustle, attendant on an immediate departure, though the day to be devoted to repose and reflection was spent under such strange circumstances, and in so wonderful a place. The idea was a pleasant one. Besides, we all began to get used to this kind of existence. I had almost ceased to think of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, of the trees, houses, and towns, in fact, about any terrestrial necessities. In our peculiar position, we were far above such reflections. The grotto was a vast and magnificent hall. Along its granitic soil the stream flowed placidly and pleasantly. So great a distance was it now from its fiery source that its water was scarcely lukewarm, and could be drunk without delay or difficulty. After a frugal breakfast, the professor made up his mind to devote some hours to putting his notes and calculations in order. In the first place, he said, I have a good many to verify and prove, in order that we may know our exact position. I wish to be able, on our return to the upper regions, to make a map of our journey, a kind of vertical section of the globe, which will be, as it were, the profile of the expedition. That would indeed be a curious work, uncle. But can you make your observations with anything like certainty and precision? I can. I have never on any occasion failed to note with great care the angles and slopes. I am certain as to have made no mistake. Take the compass and examine how she points. I looked at the instrument with care. East 1/4 southeast. Very good, resumed the professor, noting the observation and going through some rapid calculations. I make out that we have journeyed 250 miles from the point of our departure. Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads. Certainly, and at this very moment it is possible that fierce tempests are raging above, and that men and ships are battling against the angry blast just over our heads. It is quite within the range of possibility, rejoined my uncle, smiling. And that whales are playing in shoals, thrashing the bottom of the sea, the roof of our adamantine prison. Be quite at rest at that point. There is no danger of their breaking through. But to return to our calculations, we are to the southeast, 250 miles from the base of Sneffels, and according to my preceding notes, I think we have gone 16 leagues in a downward direction. 16 leagues, 50 miles, I cried. I am sure of it. But that is the extreme limit allowed by science for the thickness of the earth's crust, I replied, referring to my geological studies. I do not contravene that assertion, was his quiet answer. And at this stage of our journey, according to all known laws on the increase of heat, there should be here a temperature of 1500 degrees of Reaumur. There should be, you say, my boy? In which case this granite would not exist, but in a state of fusion. But you perceive, my boy, that it is not so, and that facts, as usual, are very stubborn things, overruling all theories. I am forced to yield to the evidence of my senses, but I am nevertheless very much surprised. What heat does the thermometer really indicate? Continued the philosopher. 27/6. So that science is wrong by 1474 degrees and 4/10, according to which it is demonstrated that the proportional increase in temperature is an exploded error. Humphrey Davy here shines forth in all his glory. He is right, and I have acted wisely to believe him. Have you any answer to make to this statement? Had I chosen to have spoken, I might have said a great deal. I in no way admitted the theory of Humphrey Davy. I still held out for the theory of proportional increase of heat, though I did not feel it. I was far more willing to allow that this chimney of an extinct volcano was covered by lava, of a kind refractory to heat, in fact, a bad conductor, which did not allow the great increase of temperature to percolate through its sides. The hot water jet supported my view of the matter. But without entering on a long and useless discussion, or seeking for new arguments to controvert my uncle, I contented myself with taking up facts as they were. Well, sir, I take for granted that all your calculations are correct, but allow me to draw from them a rigorous and definite conclusion. Go on, my boy, have your say, cried my uncle good-humoredly. At the place where we now are, under the latitude of Iceland, the terrestrial depth is about 1,583 leagues, 1,583 and a quarter. Well, suppose we say 1,600 in round numbers. Now, out of a voyage of 1,600 leagues, we have completed 16. As you say, what then? At the expense of a diagonal journey of no less than 85 leagues, exactly. We have been 20 days about it, exactly 20. Now, 16 is the 100th part of our contemplated expedition. If we go on in this way, we shall be 2,000 days. That is about 5 years and a half going down. The professor folded his arms, listened, but did not speak. Without counting that if a vertical descent of 16 leagues cost us a horizontal of 85, we shall have to go about 8,000 leagues to the southeast, and we must therefore come out somewhere in the circumference long before we can hope to reach the center. Bother your calculations, cried my uncle in one of his old rages. On what basis do they rest? How do you know that this passage does not take us direct to the end we require? Moreover, I have in my favor, fortunately, a precedent. What I have undertaken to do, another has done, and he having succeeded, why should I not be equally successful? I hope indeed you will be. Still, I suppose I may be allowed to. You are allowed to hold your tongue, cried Professor Hardwigg, when you talk so unreasonably as this. I saw at once that the old doctorial professor was still alive in my uncle, and Fearful to rouse his angry passions, I dropped the unpleasant subject. "Now then," he explained, "consult the manometer. What does that indicate?" "A considerable amount of pressure." "Very good. You see, then, that by descending slowly and by gradually accustoming ourselves to the density of this lower atmosphere, we shall not suffer." "Well, I suppose not, except it may be a certain amount of pain in the ears," was my rather grim reply. "That, my dear boy, is nothing, and you will easily get rid of that source of discomfort by bringing the exterior air to communication with the air contained in your lungs." "Perfectly," said I, for I had quite made up my mind in no wise to contradict my uncle. I should fancy almost that I should experience a certain amount of satisfaction in making a plunge into this dense atmosphere. Have you taken note of how wonderfully sound is propagated? Of course I have. There can be no doubt that a journey into the interior of the earth would be an excellent cure for deafness. "But then, uncle," I ventured mildly to observe, "this density will continue to increase." "Yes, according to a law which, however, is scarcely defined. It is true that the intensity of weight will diminish just in proportion to the depth to which we go. You know very well that it is on the surface of the earth that its action is most powerfully felt, while, on the contrary, in the very center of the earth, bodies cease to have any weight at all." "I know that is the case, but as we progress, will not the atmosphere finally assume the density of water?" "I know it. When placed under the pressure of 710 atmospheres," cried my uncle, "with imperturbable gravity. And when we are still lower down, I ask with natural anxiety, well, lower down, the density will become even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog?" "Well, my worthy nephew, we must ballast ourselves by filling our pockets with stones," said Professor Hardwigg. "Faith, uncle, you have an answer for everything," was my only reply. I began to feel that it was unwise of me to go any farther into the wide field of hypotheses, for I should certainly have reviewed some difficulty, or rather impossibility, that would have enraged the professor. It was evident, nevertheless, that the air, under a pressure which might be multiplied by thousands of atmospheres, would end by becoming perfectly solid, and that then, admitting our bodies resisted the pressure, we should have to stop in spite of all the reasonings in the world. Facts overcome all arguments. But I thought it best not to urge this argument. My uncle would simply have quoted the example of Saknussemm. Supposing the learned Icelander's journey ever really to have taken place, there was one simple answer to be made. In the 16th century neither the barometer nor the manometer had been invented. How then could Saknussemm have been able to discover when he did reach the center of the earth? This unanswerable and learned objection I, however, kept to myself, and bracing up my courage, awaited the course of events, little aware of how adventurous yet were to be the incidents of our remarkable journey. The rest of this day of leisure and repose was spent in calculation and conversation. I made it a point to agree with the professor in everything, but I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without taking any such trouble about the cause and effect, went blindly onwards wherever destiny chose to lead him. End of chapter 22. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 23. Alone. It must in all truth be confessed, things as yet had gone well, and I should have acted in bad taste to have complained, if the true medium of our difficulties did not increase. It was within the range of possibility that we might ultimately reach the end of our journey. Then what glory would be ours! I began, in the newly aroused ardor of my soul, to speak enthusiastically to the professor. Well, was I serious? The whole state in which we existed was a mystery, and it was impossible to know whether or not I was earnest. For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid. Some were even of a most frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were forever going down into the solid interior mass. During some days we actually descended a league and a half, even 2 leagues toward the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide Hans. Without him we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and thanks to him many a dangerous pass was got over, where but for him we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad, simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant. During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this peculiar period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory, even now, makes my soul shudder and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say, that there were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles of rocks and oceans and continents and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. Now, the memorable day, the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was on this occasion walking in front. My uncle had charge of one of Ruhmkorff's coils, I had possession of the other. By means of its light I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning round, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is to go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps, and while doing so walked for at least a quarter of an hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul. I called aloud. No reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began for the first time to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my whole body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be two roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do is to go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I had ever seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, well knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no. The most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, come, said I to myself, since there is only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, if I make haste, I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener, had there been one, that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas and to reunite them under the form of reasoning required some time. I could not at all once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage to his shoulder. I now remembered this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as possible, there is another sure means of not losing my way, a thread to guide me through the labyrinth subterraneous retreat, one which I had forgotten, my faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to Bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle when he refused to allow the eider hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind before I started upwards that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite. The stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared. End of chapter 23. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 24. Lost. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to live in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically I crawled about, feeling the dry, arid rock. Never to my fancy had I ever felt anything so dry. But I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed when last I tried, if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths had my companions gone? Where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark? There was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in three awful words: lost, 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 lost at a depth which, to my finite understanding, appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders like the globe of the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house on the Konigstrasse, my dear cousin Gretchen, all that world which had before vanished like a shadow floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal! Under the influence of a terrible hallucination, I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me like the scenes of a panorama: the ship and its inmates, Iceland M. Friedrichsen, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that if in my position I retain the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth, and ready too to split asunder, to rend in twain those huge and mighty vaults which stand above my head? Who could enable me to find my road and regain my companions? Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle!" was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips, for I thoroughly understood how deeply and sorrowfully the worthy professor would regret my loss, and how in his turn he would patiently seek for me. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had no recourse to prayer, and little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked. I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had at first wholly forgotten, 3 days' provisions. Moreover, my water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. But which course should I take? Should I go upwards or again descend? Doubtless it was right to retrace my steps in an upward direction. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once at this spot, once the river at my feet, I could at all events regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. Why had I not thought of this before? This at last was a reasonable hope of safety. The most important thing then to be done was to discover the bed of the Hansbach. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult, but I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest and knows there is only one road to follow. During one whole hour nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel, to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before, but no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate and fell inanimate on the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock. Lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction without guide, clue, or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die, to lie down and die, the most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day, perhaps, when my fossil bones were found, their discovery so far below the level of the earth might give rise to solemn and interesting scientific discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler and paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved, flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. Every instant it seemed to me that it was about to vanish and to leave me forever in utter darkness. At last, one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated upon it all the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see, and then I was to be lost forever in Cimmerian and tenebrous shadows. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows a complete destruction and extinction of its power. Light is so diffuse, so subtle, that it permeates everywhere, and whatever little may remain, the retina of the eye will succeed in finding it. In this place nothing, the absolute obscurity, made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling in getting against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I knew not what I did. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth, always going downwards, running wildly underneath the terrestrial crust like an inhabitant of the subterranean furnaces, screaming, roaring, howling until bruised by the pointed rocks, falling and picking myself up, all covered with blood, seeking madly to drink the blood which dripped from my torn features, mad because this blood only trickled over my face, and watching always for this horrid wall which were presented to me, the fearful obstacle against which I could not dash my head. Where was I going? It was impossible to say. I was perfectly ignorant of the matter. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell, a heavy, inert mass, along the side of the tunnel and lost consciousness. End of chapter 24. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 25. The Whispering Gallery. When at last I came back to a sense of life and being, my face was wet, but wet, as I soon knew, with tears. How long this state of insensibility lasted, it is quite impossible for me now to say. I had no means left to me of taking any account of time. Never since the creation of the world had such a solitude as mine existed. I was completely abandoned. After my fall, I lost much blood. I felt myself flooded with the life-giving fluid. My first sensation was perhaps a natural one. Why was I not dead? Because I was alive, there was something left to do. I tried to make up my mind to think no longer. As far as I was able, I drove away all ideas, and utterly overcome by pain and grief, I crouched against the granite wall. I just commenced to feel the fainting coming on again, and the sensation that this was the last struggle before complete annihilation, when, on a sudden, a violent uproar reached my ears. It had some resemblance to the prolonged rumbling voice of thunder, and I clearly distinguished sonorous voices, lost one after the other in the distant depths of the gulf. Whence came this noise? Naturally, it was to be supposed from new phenomena which were taking place in the bosom of the solid mass of Mother Earth. The explosion of some gaseous vapors, or the fall of some solid of the granite or other rock. Again I listened with deep attention. I was extremely anxious to hear if this strange and inexplicable sound was likely to be renewed. A whole quarter of an hour elapsed in painful expectation. Deep and solemn silence reigned in the tunnel, so still that I could hear the beatings of my own heart. I waited with a strange kind of hopefulness. Suddenly my ear, which leaned accidentally against the wall, appeared to catch, as it were, the faintest echo of a sound. I thought that I heard vague, incoherent, and distant voices. I quivered all over with excitement and hope. "It must be hallucination," I cried. "It cannot be. It is not true." But no, by listening more attentively, I really did convince myself that what I heard was truly the sound of human voices. To make any meaning out of the sound, however, was beyond my power. I was too weak even to hear distinctly. Still, it was a positive fact that someone was speaking. Of that I was quite certain. There was a moment of fear. A dread fell upon my soul that it might be my own words brought back to me by a distant echo. Perhaps, without knowing it, I might have been crying aloud. I resolutely closed my lips and once more placed my ear to the huge granite wall. Yes, for certain it was in truth the sound of human voices. I now, by the exercise of great determination, dragged myself along the sides of the cavern until I reached a point where I could hear more distinctly. But though I could detect the sound, I could only make out uncertain, strange, and incomprehensible words. They reached my ear as if they had been spoken in a low tone, murmured as if it were afar off. At last I made out the word "forlorad," repeated several times in a tone betokening great mental anguish and sorrow. What could this word mean, and who was speaking it? It must be either my uncle or the guide, Hans. If, therefore, I could hear them, they must surely be able to hear me. "Help!" I cried at the top of my voice. "Help! I am dying!" I then listened with scarcely a breath. I panted with the slightest sound in the darkness, a cry, a sigh, a question, but silence reigned supreme. No answer came. In this way some minutes passed. A whole flood of ideas flashed through my mind. I began to fear that my voice, weakened by sickness and suffering, could not reach my companions who were in search for me. "It must be," they said. I cried, "Who else could by any possibility be buried 100 miles below the level of the earth?" The mere supposition was preposterous. I began, therefore, to listen again with the most breathless attention. As I moved my ears along the side of the place I was in, I found a mathematical point, as it were, where the voices appeared to attain their maximum of intensity. The word "forlorad" again distinctly reached my ear. Then came again that rolling noise like thunder which had awakened me out of my torpor. "I begin to understand," I said to myself after some little time devoted to reflection. "It is not through the solid mass that the sound reaches my ears. The walls of my cavernous retreat are of solid granite, and the most fearful explosion would not make uproar enough to penetrate them. The sound must come along the gallery itself. The place I was in must possess some peculiar acoustic properties of its own." Again I listened, and this time, yes, this time, I heard my name distinctly pronounced, cast as it were into space. It was my uncle, the professor, who was speaking. He was in conversation with the guide, and the word which had so often reached my ear, "forlorad," was a Danish word. Then I understood it all. In order to make myself heard, I too must speak, as it were, along the side of the gallery, which would carry the sound of my voice just as the wire carries the electric fluid from point to point. But there was no time to lose. If my companions were only to remove a few feet from where they stood, the acoustic effect would be over. My whispering gallery would be destroyed. I again, therefore, crawled towards the wall and said, as clearly and distinctly as I could, "Uncle Hardwigg." I then awaited a reply. Sound does not possess the property of traveling with such extreme rapidity. Besides, the density of the air at that depth from light and motion was very far from adding to the rapidity of circulation. Several seconds elapsed, which, to my excited imagination, appeared ages, and these words reached my eager ears and moved my wildly beating heart. "Harry, my boy, is that you?" A short delay between question and answer. "Yes, yes." "Where are you?" "Lost." "And your lamp?" "Out." "But the guiding stream?" "Is lost." "Keep your courage, Harry. We will do our best." "One moment, my uncle," I cried. "I have no longer strength to answer your questions, but for heaven's sake, do you continue to speak to me. Absolute silence, I felt, would be annihilation." "Keep up your courage," said my uncle. "As you are so weak, do not speak. We have been searching for you in all directions, but by going upwards and downwards in the gallery, my dear boy, I had begun to give over all hope. And you can never know what bitter tears of sorrow and regret I have shed. At last, supposing you to be still on the road beside Hansbach, we again descended, firing off guns as signals. Now, however, we have found you, and that our voices reach each other, it may be a long time before we actually meet. We are conversing by means of some extraordinary acoustic arrangement of the labyrinth. But do not despair, my dear boy. It is something gained even to hear each other." While he was speaking, my brain was at work reflecting a certain undefined hope, vague and shapeless as yet, made my heart beat wildly. In the first place, it was absolutely necessary for me to know one thing. I once more, therefore, leaned my head against the wall, which I almost touched with my lips, and again spoke. "Uncle, my boy," was his answer after a few moments. "Is it the utmost consequence that we should know how far we are asunder?" "That is not difficult." "You have your chronometer at hand?" I asked. "Certainly." "Well, take it into your hand, pronounce my name, noting exactly the second at which you speak. I will reply as soon as I hear your words, and you will then note exactly the moment at which my reply reaches you." "Very good. And the meantime between my question and your answer will be the time occupied by my voice in reaching you." "That is exactly what I mean, uncle. was my eager reply. Are you ready? Yes. Well, make ready. I am about to pronounce your name, said the professor. I applied my ear close to the sides of the cavernous gallery, and as soon as the word Harry reached my ear, I turned round and, placing my lips to the wall, repeated the sound. 40 seconds, said my uncle. There has elapsed 40 seconds between the two words. The sound, therefore, takes 20 seconds to ascend. Now, allowing 1,020 feet for every second, we have 20,400 feet, a league and a half, and 1/8. These words fell on my soul like a kind of death knell. A league and a half, I muttered in a low and despairing voice. It shall be got over, my boy, cried my uncle in a cheery tone. Depend on us. But do you know whether to ascend or descend? I asked faintly enough. We have to descend, and I will tell you why. You have reached a vast open space, a kind of bare crossroad from which galleries diverge in every direction. That in which you are now lying must necessarily bring you to this point, for it appears that all these mighty fissures, these fractures of the globe's interior, radiate from the vast cavern which we at this moment occupy. Rouse yourself then, have courage, and continue your route. Walk if you can. If not, drag yourself along, slide if nothing else is possible. The slope must be rather rapid, and you will find strong arms to receive you at the end of your journey. Make a start, like a good fellow. These words served to rouse some kind of courage in my sinking frame. Farewell for the present, good uncle. I am about to take my departure. As soon as I start, our voices will cease to commingle. Farewell, then, until we meet again. Adieu, Harry, until we say welcome. Sure were the last words which reached my anxious ears before I commenced my weary and almost hopeless journey. This wonderful and surprising conversation which took place through the vast mass of the earth's labyrinth, these words exchanged, the speakers being about 5 miles apart, ended with hopeful and pleasant expressions. I breathed one more prayer to heaven. I sent up words of thanksgiving, believing in my inmost heart that he had led me to the only place where the voices of my friends could reach my ears. This apparently astounding acoustic mystery is easily explainable by simple natural laws. It aroused from the conductibility of the rock. There are many instances of this singular propagation of sound, which are not perceptible in its less mediate positions. In the interior gallery of St. Paul's and amid the curious caverns in Sicily, these phenomena are observable. The most marvelous of them all is known as the ear of Dionysus. These memories of the past, of my early reading and studies, came fresh to my thoughts. Moreover, I began to reason that if my uncle and I could communicate at such great a distance, no serious obstacle could exist between us. All I had to do was to follow the direction whence the sound had reached me, and logically putting it, I must reach him if my strength did not fail. I accordingly rose to my feet. I soon found, however, that I could not walk, that I must drag myself along. The slope, as I expected, was very rapid, but I allowed myself to slip down. Soon the rapidity of the descent began to assume frightful proportions and menaced a fearful fall. I clutched at the sides. I grasped at projections of rocks. I threw myself backwards, all in vain. My weakness was so great I could do nothing to save myself. Suddenly, earth failed me. I was first launched into a dark and gloomy void. I then struck against the projecting asperities of a vertical gallery, a perfect well. My head bounded against a pointed rock, and I lost all knowledge of existence. As far as I was concerned, death had claimed me for his own. End of chapter 25. Reading by Simon Wainwright.
Chapter 26. A Rapid Recovery. When I returned to the consciousness of existence, I found myself surrounded by a kind of semi-obscurity, lying on some thick and soft coverlets. My uncle was watching, his eyes fixed intently on my countenance, a grave expression on his face, a tear in his eye. At the first sigh which struggled from my bosom, he took hold of my hand. When he saw my eyes open and fix themselves upon his, he uttered a loud cry of joy. "He lives! He lives!" "Yes, my good uncle," I whispered. "My dear boy," continued the grim Professor, clasping me to his heart, "you are saved." I was deeply and unaffectedly touched by the tone in which these words were uttered, and even more by the kindly care which accompanied them. The Professor, however, was one of those men who must be severely tried in order to induce any display of affection or gentle emotion. At this moment our friend Hans, the guide, joined us. He saw my hand in that of my uncle, and I venture to say that, taciturn as he was, his eyes beamed with lively satisfaction. "Goddag," he said. "Good day, Hans, good day," I replied in as hearty a tone as I could assume. "And now, uncle, that we are together, tell me where we are. I have lost all idea of our position, as of everything else."
"Tomorrow, Harry, tomorrow," he replied. "Today you are far too weak. Your head is surrounded with bandages and poultices that must not be touched. Sleep, my boy, sleep, and tomorrow you will know all that you require."
"But," I cried, "let me know what o'clock it is, what day it is."
"It is now 11 o'clock at night, and this is once more Sunday. It is now the 9th of the month of August, and I distinctly prohibit you from asking any more questions until the 10th of the same." I was, if the truth were told, very weak indeed, and my eyes soon closed involuntarily. I did require a good night's rest, and I went off reflecting at the last moment that my perilous adventure in the interior of the earth, in total darkness, had lasted 4 days. On the morning of the next day, at my awakening, I began to look around me. My sleeping place, made of all our traveling bedding, was in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, glittering in all the colors of the rainbow, the floor of soft and silvery sand. A dim obscurity prevailed. No torch, no lamp was lighted, and yet certain unexplained beams of light penetrated from without, and made their way through the opening of the beautiful grotto. I moreover heard a vague and indefinite murmur like the ebb and flow of waves upon a strand, and sometimes I verily believed I could hear the sighing of the wind.
I began to believe that instead of being awake, I must be dreaming. Surely my brain had not been affected by my fall, and all that occurred during the last 24 hours was not the frenzied visions of madness. And yet, after some reflection, a trial of my faculties, I came to the conclusion that I could not be mistaken. Eyes and ears could not surely both deceive me. It is a ray of the blessed daylight, I said to myself, which has penetrated through some mighty fissure in the rocks. But what is the meaning of this murmur of waves, this unmistakable moaning of the salt sea billows? I can hear too plainly enough the whistling of the wind. But can I be altogether mistaken? If my uncle during my illness has but carried me back to the surface of the earth, has he, on my account, given up his wondrous expedition, or in some strange manner has it come to an end? I was puzzling my brain over these and other questions when the professor joined me.
"Good day, Harry," he cried in a joyous tone. "I fancy you are quite well."
"I'm very much better," I replied, actually sitting up in my bed.
"I knew that would be the end of it, as you slept both soundly and tranquilly. Hans and I have each taken turn to watch, and every hour we have seen visible signs of amelioration."
"You must be right, uncle," was my reply, "for I feel as if I could do justice to any meal you could put before me."
"You shall eat, my boy, you shall eat. The fever has left you. Our excellent friend Hans has rubbed your wounds and bruises with I know not what ointment, of which the Icelanders alone possesses the secret, and they have healed your bruises in the most marvelous manner. Ah, he is a wise fellow, is Master Hans."
While he was speaking, my uncle was placing before me several articles of food, which, despite his earnest injunctions, I readily devoured. As soon as the first rage of hunger was appeased, I overwhelmed him with questions, to which he now no longer hesitated to give answers. I then learned for the first time that my providential fall had brought me to the bottom of an almost perpendicular gallery. As I came down amidst a perfect shower of stones, the least of which falling on me would have crushed me to death, they came to the conclusion that I had carried with me an entire dislocated rock. Riding, as it were, on this terrible chariot, I was cast headlong into my uncle's arms, and into them I fell insensible and covered with blood.
"It is indeed a miracle," was the professor's final remark, "that you were not killed 1,000 times over. But let us take care never to separate, for surely we should risk never meeting again." "Let us take care never again to separate." These words fell with a sort of chill upon my heart. The journey, then, was not over. I looked at my uncle with surprise and astonishment. My uncle, after an instant's examination of my countenance, said, "What is the matter, Harry?"
"I want to ask you a very serious question. You say that I am all right in health?"
"Certainly you are."
"And all my limbs are sound and capable of new exertion?" I asked.
"Most undoubtedly."
"But what about my head?" was my next anxious question.
"Well, your head, except that you have one or two contusions, is exactly where it ought to be, on your shoulders,"
said my uncle, laughing. "Well, my own opinion is that my head is not exactly right. In fact, I believe myself slightly delirious."
"What makes you think so?"
"I will explain why I fancy I have lost my senses," I cried. "Have we not returned to the surface of Mother Earth?"
"Certainly not."
"Then truly I must be mad. For do I not see the light of day? Do I not hear the whistling of the wind? And can I not distinguish the wash of a great sea?"
"And that is all that makes you uneasy?"
said my uncle with a smile. "Can you explain?"
"I will not make any attempt to explain, for the whole matter is utterly inexplicable, but you shall see and judge for yourself. You will then find that geological science is as yet in its infancy, and that we are doomed to enlighten the world."
"Let us advance, then," I cried eagerly.
no longer able to restrain my curiosity. "Wait a moment, my dear Harry," he responded. "You must take precautions after your illness before going into the open air." "The open air?" "Yes, my boy. I have to warn you that the wind is rather violent, and I have no wish for you to expose yourself without necessary precautions." "But I beg to assure you that I am perfectly recovered from my illness." "Have just a little patience, my boy. A relapse would be inconvenient to all parties. We have no time to lose, as our approaching sea voyage may be of long duration." "Sea voyage?" I cried, more bewildered than ever. "Yes, you must take another day's rest, and we shall be ready to go on board by tomorrow," replied my uncle with a peculiar smile. Go on board? The words utterly astonished me. Go on board! And what and how? Had we come upon a river, a lake? Had we discovered some inland sea? Was a vessel lying at anchor in some part of the interior of the earth? My curiosity was worked up to the very highest pitch. My uncle made vain attempts to restrain me. When at last, however, he discovered that my feverish impatience would do more harm than good, and that the satisfaction of my wishes could alone restore me to a calm state of mind, he gave way. I dressed myself rapidly, and then, taking the precaution to please my uncle of wrapping myself in one of the coverlets, I rushed out of the grotto. End of chapter 26. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 27. The Central Sea. At first I saw absolutely nothing. My eyes, wholly unused to the effulgence of light, could not bear the sudden brightness, and I was compelled to close them. When I was able to reopen them, I stood still, far more stupefied than astonished. Not all the wildest effects of imagination could have conjured up such a scene. "The sea! The sea!" I cried. "Yes," replied my uncle in a tone of pardonable pride, "the Central Sea. No future navigator will deny the fact of my having discovered it, and hence of acquiring a right of giving it a name." It was quite true. A vast, limitless expanse of water, the end of a lake, if not of an ocean, spread before us, until it was lost in the distance. The shore, which was very much indented, consisted of a beautiful soft golden sand, mixed with small shells, the long deserted home of some of the creatures of a past age. The waves broke incessantly, and with a peculiarly sonorous murmur to be found in underground localities. A slight frothy flake arose as the wind blew along the pellucid waters, and many a dash of spray was blown into my face. The mighty superstructure of rock, which rose above to an inconceivable height, left only a narrow opening, but where we stood there was a large margin of strand. On all sides were capes of promontories and enormous cliffs, partially worn by the eternal breaking of the waves through countless ages. And as I gazed from side to side, the mighty rocks faded away like a fleecy film of cloud. It was in reality an ocean with the usual characteristics of an inland sea, only horribly wild, so rigid, cold, and savage. One thing startled and puzzled me greatly. How was it that I was able to look upon that vast sheet of water instead of being plunged into utter darkness? The vast landscape before me was lit up like day, but there was wanting the dazzling brilliancy, the splendid irradiation of the sun, the pale cold illumination of the moon, the brightness of the stars. The illuminating power in this subterranean region, from its trembling and recurring character, is clear dry whiteness. The very slight elevation of its temperature, its great superiority to that of the moon, was evidently electric, something in the nature of the aurora borealis, only that its phenomena were constant, and able to light up the whole of the ocean cavern. The tremendous vault above our heads, the sky, so to speak,
appeared to be composed of a conglomeration of nebulous vapors in constant motion. I should originally have supposed that under such an atmospheric pressure as must exist in that place, the evaporation of water could not really take place, and yet from the action of some physical law which escaped my memory, there were heavy and dense clouds rolling along that mighty vault, partially concealing the roof. Electric currents produced astonishing play of light and shade in the distance, especially around the heavier clouds. Deep shadows were cast beneath, and then suddenly, between two clouds, there would come a ray of unusual beauty and remarkable intensity. And yet it was not like the sun, for it gave no heat. The effect was sad and excruciatingly melancholy. Instead of a noble firmament of blue, studded with stars, there was above me a heavy roof of granite, which seemed to crush me. Gazing around, I began to think of the theory of the English captain who compared the earth to a vast hollow sphere in the interior of which the air is retained in a luminous state by means of atmospheric pressure, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpine, circled there in their mysterious orbits. After all, suppose the old fellow was right. In truth, we were imprisoned, bound as it were in a vast excavation. Its width it was impossible to make out, the shore on either hand widening rapidly until lost to sight, while its length was equally uncertain. A haze on the distant horizon bounded our view. As to its height, we could see that it must be many miles to the roof. Looking upward, it was impossible to discover where the stupendous roof began. The lowest of the clouds must have been floating at an elevation of 2,000 yards, a height greater than that of terrestrial vapors, which circumstance was doubtless owing to the extreme density of the air. I use the word cavern in order to give an idea of the place. I cannot describe its awful grandeur. Human language fails to convey an idea of its savage sublimity. Whether this singular vacuum had or had not been caused by the sudden cooling of the earth when in a state of fusion, I could not say. I had read of most wonderful and gigantic caverns, but none in any way like this. The great grotto of Guachara in Colombia, visited by the learned Humboldt, the vast and partially explored Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, what were these holes in the earth to that in which I stood in speechless admiration? With its vapory clouds, its electric light, and the mighty ocean slumbering in its bosom. Imagination, not description, can alone give an idea of the splendor and vastness of the cave. I gazed at these marvels in profound silence. Words were utterly wanting to indicate the sensations of wonder I experienced. I seemed, as I stood upon that mysterious shore, as if I were some wandering inhabitant of a distant planet, present for the first time at the spectacle of some terrestrial phenomena belonging to another existence. To give body and existence to such new sensations would have required the coinage of new words, and here my feeble brain found itself wholly at fault. I looked on, I thought, I reflected, I admired, in a state of stupefaction not altogether unmingled with fear. The unexpected spectacle restored some color to my pallid cheeks. I seemed to be actually getting better under the influence of this novelty. Moreover, the vivacity of the dense atmosphere reanimated my body by inflating my lungs with unaccustomed oxygen. It will be readily conceived that after an imprisonment of 47 days in a dark and miserable tunnel, it was with infinite delight that I breathed this saline air. It was like the genial reviving influence of the salt sea waves. My uncle had already got over the first surprise. With the Latin poet Horace, his idea was that not to admire is all the art I know, to make man happy and to keep him so. Well, he said,
after giving me time thoroughly to appreciate the marvels of this underground sea, do you feel strong enough to walk up and down?" "Certainly," was my ready answer. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure." "Well, then, my boy," he said, "lean on my arm and we will stroll along the beach." I accepted his offer eagerly, and we began to walk along the shores of this extraordinary lake. To our left were abrupt rocks, piled one upon the other, a stupendous titanic pile. Down their sides leaped innumerable cascades, which at last, becoming limpid and murmuring streams, were lost in the waters of the lake. Light vapors, which rose here and there and floated in fleecy clouds from rock to rock, indicated hot springs, which also poured their superfluity into the vast reservoir at our feet. Among them I recognized our old and faithful stream, the Hansbach, which, lost in that wild basin, seemed as if it had been flowing since the creation of the world. "We shall miss our excellent friend," I remarked with a deep sigh. "Bah!" said my uncle testily, "what matters it? That or another, it is all the same." I thought the remark ungrateful, and felt almost inclined to say so, but I forbore. At this moment my attention was attracted by an unexpected spectacle. After we had gone about 500 yards, we suddenly turned a steep promontory and found ourselves close to a lofty forest. It consisted of straight trunks with tufted tops, in shapes like parasols. The air seemed to have no effect upon these trees, which, in spite of a tolerable breeze, remained as still and motionless as if they had been petrified. I hastened forward. I could find no name for these singular formations. Did they not belong to the 2,000 and more known trees, or were we to make the discovery of a new growth? By no means. When we at last reached the forest and stood beneath the trees, my surprise gave way to admiration. In truth, I was simply in the presence of very ordinary product of the earth, of singular and gigantic proportions. My uncle unhesitatingly called them by their real names. "It is only," he said in his coolest manner, "a forest of mushrooms." On close examination I found that he was not mistaken. Judge of the development attained by the product of damp, hot soils. I had heard that the Lycoperdon giganteum reaches 9 feet in circumference, but here were white mushrooms nearly 40 feet high and with tops of equal dimensions. They grew in countless thousands. The light could not make its way through their massive substance, and beneath them reigned a gloomy and mystic darkness. Still I wished to go forward. The cold in the shades of this singular forest was intense. For nearly an hour we wandered about in this visible darkness. At length I left the spot, and once more returned to the shores of the lake, to light and comparative warmth. But the amazing vegetation of subterraneous land was not confined to gigantic mushrooms. New wonders awaited us at every step. We had not gone many hundred yards when we came upon a mighty group of other trees with discolored leaves, the common humble trees of Mother Earth, of an exorbitant and phenomenal size, lycopods 100 feet high, flowering ferns as tall as pines, gigantic grasses. "Astonishing, magnificent, splendid!" cried my uncle. "Here we have before us the whole flora of the second period of the world, that of transition. Behold the humble plants of our gardens, which in the first ages of the world were mighty trees. Look around you, my dear Harry. No botanist ever before gazed on such a sight." My uncle's enthusiasm, always a little more than was required, was now excusable. "You are right, uncle," I remarked. "Providence appears to have designed the preservation in this vast and mysterious hothouse of antediluvian plants, to prove the sagacity of learned men in figuring them so marvelously on paper." "Well said, my boy, very well said. It is indeed a mighty hothouse. But you would also be within the bounds of reason and common sense. if you added that it is also a vast menagerie." I looked rather anxiously around. If the animals were as exaggerated as the plants, the matter would certainly be serious. "A menagerie?" "Doubtless. Look at the dust we are treading underfoot. Behold the bones with which the whole soil of the seashore is covered." "Bones!" I replied. "Yes, certainly, the bones of antediluvian animals." I stooped down as I spoke and picked up one or two singular remains, relics of a bygone age. It was easy to give a name to these gigantic bones, in some instances as big as trunks of trees. "Here is clearly the lower jawbone of a mastodon," I cried, almost as warmly and enthusiastically as my uncle. "Here are the molars of the Dinotherium. Here is a leg bone which belonged to the Megatherium. You are right, uncle. It is indeed a menagerie, for the mighty animals to which these bones once belonged have lived and died on the shores of this subterranean sea, under the shadow of these plants. Look, yonder are whole skeletons, and yet—" "And yet, nephew?" said my uncle, noticing that I suddenly came to a full stop. "I do not understand the presence of such beasts in granite caverns, however vast and prodigious," was my reply. "Why not?" said my uncle, with very much of his old professional impatience. "Because it is well known that animal life only existed on earth during the secondary period, when the sedimentary soil was formed by the alluviums, and thus replaced the hot and burning rocks of the primitive age." "I have listened to you earnestly and with patience, Harry, and I have a simple and clear answer to your objections, and that is, that this itself is a sedimentary soil."
"How can that be, at such enormous depth from the surface of the earth?"
"The fact can be explained both simply and geologically. At a certain period the earth consisted only of an elastic crust, liable to alternative upward and downward movements in virtue of the law of attraction. It is very probable that many a landslip took place in those days, and that large portions of sedimentary soil were cast into huge and mighty chasms."
"Quite possible," I dryly remarked. "But, uncle, if these antediluvian animals formerly lived in these subterranean regions, what more likely than that one of these monsters may at this moment be concealed behind one of yonder mighty rocks?" As I spoke, I looked keenly around, examining with care every point of the horizon, but nothing alive appeared to exist on these deserted shores. I now felt rather fatigued, and told my uncle so. The walk and excitement were too much for me in my weak state. I therefore seated myself at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves broke in incessant rolls. I looked round a bay, formed by projections of vast granitic rocks. At the extreme end was a little port, protected by huge pyramids of stones. A brig or 3 or 4 schooners might have lain there with perfect ease. So natural did it seem, that every minute my imagination induced me to expect a vessel coming out under all sail, and making for the open sea under the influence of a warm southerly breeze. But the fantastic illusion never lasted more than a minute. We were the only living creatures in this subterranean world. During certain periods there was an utter cessation of wind, when a silence deeper, more terrible than the silence of the desert, fell upon these solitary and arid rocks, and seemed to hang like a leaden weight upon the waters of this singular ocean. I sought, amid the awful stillness, to penetrate through the distant fog, to tear down the veil which concealed the mysterious distance. What unspoken words were murmured by my trembling lips? What questions did I wish to ask, and did not? Where did this sea end? To what did it lead? Should we ever be able to examine its distant shores? But my uncle had no doubts about the matter. He was convinced that our enterprise would in the end be successful. For my part, I was in a state of painful indecision.
I desired to embark on the journey and to succeed, and still I feared the result. After we had passed an hour or more in silent contemplation of the wondrous spectacle, we rose and went down towards the bank on our way to the grotto, which I was not sorry to gain. After a slight repast, I sought refuge in slumber, and at length, after many and tedious struggles, sleep came over my weary eyes. End of chapter 27. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 28. Launching the Raft. On the morning of the next day, to my great surprise, I awoke completely restored. I thought a bath would be delightful after my long illness and sufferings, so soon after rising I went and plunged into the waters of this new Mediterranean. The bath was cool, fresh, and invigorating. I came back to breakfast with an excellent appetite. Hans, our worthy guide, thoroughly understood how to cook such eatables as we were able to provide. He had both fire and water at discretion, so that he was enabled slightly to weary monotony of our ordinary repast. Our morning meal was like a capital English breakfast, with coffee by way of a wind up, and never had this delicious beverage been so welcome and refreshing. My uncle had sufficient regard for my state of health not to interrupt me in the enjoyment of the meal, but he was evidently delighted when I had finished.
"Now then," said he, "come with me. It is the height of the tide, and I am anxious to study its curious phenomena."
"What!" I cried, rising in astonishment. "Did you say the tide, uncle?"
"Certainly I did."
"You do not mean to say," I replied in a tone of respectful doubt, "that the influence of the sun and moon is felt here below?"
"And pray, why not? Are not all bodies influenced by the law of universal attraction? Why should this vast underground sea be exempt from the general law, the rule of the universe? Besides, there is nothing like that which is proved and demonstrated. Despite the great atmospheric pressure down here, you will notice that this inland sea rises and falls with as much regularity as the Atlantic itself."
As my uncle spoke, we reached the sandy shore, and saw and heard the waves breaking monotonously on the beach. They were evidently rising. "This is truly the flood," I cried, looking at the water at my feet.
"Yes, my excellent nephew," replied my uncle, rubbing his hands with the gusto of a philosopher, "and you see by these several streaks of foam that the tide rises at least 10 or 12 feet."
"It is indeed marvelous."
"By no means," he responded. "On the contrary, it is quite natural."
"It may appear so in your eyes, my dear uncle," was my reply, "but all the phenomena of the place appear to me to partake of the marvelous. It is almost impossible to believe that which I see. Who in his wildest dreams could have imagined that beneath the crust of our earth there could exist a real ocean, with ebbing and flowing tides, with its changes of winds, and even its storms? I, for one, should have laughed the suggestion to scorn."
"But Harry, my boy, why not?" inquired my uncle with a pitying smile. "Is there any physical reason in opposition to it?"
"Well, if we give up the great theory of the central heat of the earth, I certainly can offer no reasons why anything should be looked upon as impossible."
"Then you will own," he added, "that the system of Sir Humphry Davy is fully justified by what we have seen?"
"I allow that it is, and that point once granted, I certainly can see no reason for doubting the existence of seas and other wonders, even countries in the interior of the globe."
"That is so. But of course these varied countries are uninhabited?"
"Well, I grant that it is more likely than not. Still, I do not see why this sea should not have given shelter to some species of unknown fish."
"Hitherto we have not discovered any, and the probabilities are rather against our ever doing so," observed the Professor.
I was losing my skepticism in the presence of these wonders. "Well, I am determined to solve the question.
It is my intention to try my luck with my fishing line and hook."
"Certainly, make the experiment,"
said my uncle, pleased with my enthusiasm.
"While we are about it, it will certainly be only proper to discover all the secrets of this extraordinary region."
"But after all, where are we now?" I asked. "All this time I have quite forgotten to ask you a question which doubtless your philosophical instruments have long since answered."
"Well," replied the Professor, "examining the situation from only one point of view, we are now distant 350 leagues from Iceland."
"So much!" was my exclamation.
"I have gone over the matter several times, and am sure not to have made a mistake of 500 yards," replied my uncle positively.
"And as to the direction, are we still going to the southeast?"
"Yes, with a western declination of 19 degrees 42 minutes, just as it is above."
The declination is the variation of the needle from the true meridian of a place.
"As for the inclination, I have discovered a very curious fact."
Inclination is the dip of the magnetic needle with a tendency to incline towards the earth. What may that be, uncle? Your information interests me.
"Why, that the needle, instead of dipping towards the pole as it doth on earth in the northern hemisphere, has an upward tendency."
"This proves," I cried, "that the great point of magnetic attraction lies somewhere between the surface of the earth and the spot we have succeeded in reaching."
"Exactly, my observant nephew,"
exclaimed my uncle, elated and delighted.
"and it is quite probable that if we succeed in getting toward the polar regions, somewhere near the 73rd degree of latitude, where Sir James Ross discovered the magnetic pole, we shall behold the needle point directly upward. We have therefore discovered by analogy that this great center of attraction is not situated at a very great depth."
"Well," said I, rather surprised, "this discovery will astonish experimental philosophers. It was never suspected."
"Science, great, mighty, and in the end unerring," replied my uncle dogmatically, "science has fallen into many errors, errors which have been fortunate and useful rather than otherwise, for they have been the stepping stones to truth."
After some further discussion, I turned to another matter. "Have you any idea of the depth we have reached?"
"We are now," continued the Professor, "exactly 35 leagues above 100 miles down into the interior of the earth."
"So," said I, after measuring the distance on the map, "we are now beneath the Scottish Highlands, and have over our heads the lofty Grampian Hills."
"You are quite right," said the Professor, laughing. "It sounds very alarming, the weight being heavy, but the vault which supports this vast mass of earth and rock is solid and safe. The mighty architect of the universe has constructed it of solid materials. Man, even in his highest flights of vivid and poetic imagination, never thought of such things. What are the finest arches of our bridges, what the vaulted roofs of our cathedrals, to that mighty dome above us, and beneath which floats an ocean with its storms and calms and tides?"
"I admire it all as much as you can, uncle, and have no fear that our granite sky will fall upon our heads. But now that we have discussed matters of science and discovery, what are your future intentions? Are you not thinking of getting back to the surface of our beautiful earth?" This was said more as a feeler than with any hope of success.
"Go back, nephew!" cried my uncle in a tone of alarm. "You are not surely thinking of anything so absurd or cowardly. No, my intention is to advance and continue our journey. We have as yet been singularly fortunate, and henceforth I hope we shall be more so."
"But," said I, "how are we to cross yonder liquid plain?"
"It is not my intention to leap into it head foremost, or even to swim across it, like Leander over the Hellespont. But as oceans are, after all, only great lakes, inasmuch as they are surrounded by land, so does it stand to reason that this central sea is circumscribed by granite surroundings."
"Doubtless," was my natural reply.
Well, then, do you not think that when once we reach the other end, we shall find some means of continuing our journey?
Probably. But what extent do you allow to this internal ocean?
Well, I should fancy it to extend about 40 or 50 leagues, more or less.
But even supposing this approximation to be a correct one, what then? I asked.
My dear boy, we have no time for further discussion. We shall embark tomorrow.
I looked around with surprise and incredulity. I could see nothing in the shape of boat or vessel. What? I cried. We are about to launch out upon an unknown sea? And where, if I may ask, is the vessel to carry us?
Well, my dear boy, it will not be exactly what you would call a vessel. For the present, we must be content with a good and solid raft.
A raft! I cried incredulously. But down here a raft is as impossible of construction as a vessel, and I am at loss to imagine.
My good Harry, if you were to listen instead of talking so much, you would hear,
said my uncle, waxing a little impatient. I should hear?
Yes, certain knocks with the hammer, which Hans is now employing to make the raft. He has been at work for many hours.
Making a raft?
Yes.
But where has he found trees suitable for such a construction?
He found the trees all ready to his hand. Come, and you shall see our excellent guide at work.
More and more amazed at what I heard and saw, I followed my uncle like one in a dream. After a walk of about a quarter of an hour, I saw Hans at work on the other side of the promontory which formed our natural port. A few minutes more and I was beside him. To my great surprise, on the sandy shore lay a half finished raft. It was made from beams of a very peculiar wood, and a great number of limbs, joints, bows, and pieces lay about, sufficient to have constructed a fleet of ships and boats. I turned to my uncle, silent with astonishment and awe. "Where did all this wood come from?" I cried. "What wood is it?"
Well, there is pine wood, fir, and the palms of the northern regions, mineralized by the action of the sea," he replied sententiously.
"Can it be possible?"
"Yes," said the learned Professor. "What you see is called fossil wood."
"But then," cried I, after reflecting for a moment, "like the lignites, it must be as hard and as heavy as iron, and therefore will certainly not float."
"Sometimes that is the case. Many of these woods have become true anthracites, but others again, like those you see before you, have only undergone one phase of fossil transformation. But there is no proof like demonstration," added my uncle, picking one or two of these precious waifs and casting them into the sea. The piece of wood, after having disappeared for a moment, came to the surface and floated about with the oscillation produced by wind and tide. "Are you convinced?"
said my uncle with a self-satisfied smile. "I am convinced," I cried, "that what I see is incredible." The fact was that my journey into the interior of the earth was rapidly changing all preconceived notions, and day by day preparing me for the marvelous. I should not have been surprised to have seen a fleet of native canoes afloat upon that silent sea. The very next evening, thanks to the industry and ability of Hans, the raft was finished. It was about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. The beams, bound together with stout ropes, were solid and firm, and once launched by our united efforts, the improvised vessel floated tranquilly upon the waters of what the Professor had well named the Central Sea. End of chapter 28. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 29. On the Waters, a Raft Voyage. On the 13th of August we were up betimes. There was no time to be lost. We now had to inaugurate a new kind of locomotion, which would have the advantage of being rapid and not fatiguing. A mast made of two pieces of wood fastened together to give additional strength a yard made from another one, the sail a linen sheet from our bed. We were fortunately in no want of cordage, and the whole on trial appeared solid and seaworthy. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the eager and enthusiastic Professor gave the signal to embark, the victuals, the luggage, all our instruments, our weapons, and a goodly supply of sweet water, which we had collected from springs in the rocks, were placed on the raft. Hans had with considerable ingenuity contrived a rudder, which enabled him to guide the floating apparatus with ease. He took the tiller as a matter of course. The worthy man was as good a sailor as he was a guide and duck hunter. I then let go the painter which held us to the shore, the sail was brought to the wind, and we made a rapid offing. Our sea voyage had at length commenced, and once more we were making for distant and unknown regions. Just as we were about to leave the little port where the raft had been constructed, my uncle, who was very strong as to geographic nomenclature, wanted to give it a name, and among others suggested mine. "Well," said I, "before you decide, I have another to propose."
"Well, out with it."
"I should like to call it Gretchen. Port Gretchen will sound very well on our future map."
"Well, then, Port Gretchen let it be," said the Professor.
And thus it was that the memory of my dear girl was attached to our adventurous and memorable expedition. When we left the shore, the wind was blowing from the northward and eastward. We went directly before the wind at a much greater speed than might have been expected from a raft. The dense layers of atmosphere at that depth had great propelling power, and acted upon the sail with considerable force. At the end of an hour, my uncle, who had been taking careful observations, was enabled to judge of the rapidity with which we moved. It was far beyond anything seen in the upper world.
"If," he said, "we continue to advance at our present rate, we shall have traveled at least 30 leagues in 24 hours. With a mere raft, this is an almost incredible velocity."
I certainly was surprised, and without making any reply went forward upon the raft. Already the northern shore was fading away on the edge of the horizon. The two shores appeared to separate more and more, leaving a wide and open space for our departure. Before me I could see nothing but the vast and apparently limitless sea upon which we floated, the only living objects in sight. Huge and dark clouds cast their gray shadows below, shadows which seemed to crush that colorless and sullen water by their weight. Anything more suggestive of gloom and of regions of nether darkness I never beheld. Silvery rays of electric light, reflected here and there upon some small spots of water, brought up luminous sparkles in the long wake of our cumbrous bark. Presently we were wholly out of sight of land. Not a vestige could be seen, nor any indication of where we were going. So still and motionless did we seem, without any distant point to fix our eyes on, that but for the phosphoric light at the wake of the raft, I should have fancied that we were still and motionless. But I knew that we were advancing at a very rapid rate. About 12 o'clock in the day, vast collections of seaweed were discovered surrounding us on all sides. I was aware of the extraordinary vegetative power of these plants, which have been known to creep along the bottom of the great ocean, and stop the advance of large ships. But never were seaweeds ever seen so gigantic and wonderful as those of the Central Sea. I could well imagine how, seen at a distance, tossing and heaving on the summit of the billows, the long lines of algae have been taken for living things, and thus have been fertile sources of the belief in sea serpents. Our raft swept past great specimens of fucus and sea wrack, from 3,000 to 4,000 feet in length, immense, incredibly long, looking like snakes that stretched out far beyond our horizon. It afforded me great amusement to gaze on their variegated ribbon-like endless lengths. Hour after hour passed without our coming to the termination of these floating weeds.
If my astonishment increased, my patience was well nigh exhausted. What natural force could possibly have produced such abnormal and extraordinary plants? What must have been the aspect of the globe during the first centuries of its formation, when, under the combined action of heat and humidity, the vegetable kingdom occupied its vast surface to the exclusion of everything else? These were considerations of never-ending interest for the geologist and the philosopher. All this while we were advancing on our journey, and at length night came. But, as I had remarked the evening before, the luminous state of the atmosphere was in nothing diminished. Whatever was the cause, it was a phenomenon upon the duration of which we could calculate with certainty. As soon as our supper had been disposed of, and some little speculative conversation indulged in, I stretched myself at the foot of the mast, and presently went to sleep. Hans remained motionless at the tiller, allowing the raft to rise and fall on the waves. The wind being aft and the sail square, all he had to do was to keep his oar in the center. Ever since we had taken our departure from the newly named Port Gretchen, my worthy uncle had directed me to keep a regular log of our day's navigation, with instructions to put down even the most minute particulars. Every interesting and curious phenomenon, the direction of the wind, our rate of sailing, the distance we went, in a word, every incident of our extraordinary voyage. From our log, therefore, I tell the story of our voyage on the Central Sea. Friday, August 14th. A steady breeze from the northwest. Raft progressing with extreme rapidity and going perfectly straight. Coast still dimly visible about 30 leagues to leeward. Nothing to be seen beyond the horizon in front. The extraordinary intensity of the light neither increases nor diminishes. It is singularly stationary. The weather remarkably fine, that is to say, the clouds have ascended very high, and are light and fleecy, and surrounded by an atmosphere resembling silver infusion. Thermometer plus 32 degrees centigrade. About 12 o'clock in the day, our guide Hans, having prepared and baited a hook, cast his line into the subterranean waters. The bait he used was a small piece of meat, by means of which he concealed his hook. Anxious as I was for a long time doomed to disappointment. Were these waters supplied with fish or not? That was the important question. No, was my decided answer. Then there came a sudden and rather hard tug. Hans coolly drew it in, and with it a fish, which struggled violently to escape.
A fish!
Cried my uncle. It's a sturgeon, I cried. Certainly, a small sturgeon. The Professor examined the fish carefully, noting every characteristic, and he did not coincide in my opinion. The fish had a flat head, round body, and the lower extremities covered with bony scales. Its mouth was fully without teeth. The pectoral fins, which were highly developed, sprouted direct from the body, which, properly speaking, had no tail. The animal certainly belonged to the order in which naturalists class the sturgeon, but it differed from that fish in many essential particulars. My uncle, after all, was not mistaken. After a long and patient examination, he said,
"This fish, my dear boy, belongs to a family which has been extinct for ages, and of which no trace has ever been found on earth, except fossil remains in the Devonian strata."
"You do not mean to say," I cried, "that we have captured a live specimen of a fish belonging to the primitive stock that existed before the deluge?"
"We have,"
said the Professor, who all this time was continuing his observations,
"and you may see by careful examination that these fossil fish have no identity with existing species. To hold in one's hand, therefore, a living specimen of the order is enough to make a naturalist happy for life."
"But," cried I, "to what family does it belong?"
"To the order of ganoids, an order of fish having angular scales, covered with bright animal, forming one of the family of the Cephalaspides, of the genus
Well, sir, I remarked, as I noticed my uncle hesitated to conclude.
to the genus Pteryctis. Yes, I'm certain of it. Still, though I'm confident of the correctness of my surmise, this fish offers to our notice a remarkable peculiarity never known to exist in any other fish but those which are the natives of subterranean waters, wells, lakes, in caverns, and such like hidden pools.
And what may that be?
It is blind.
Blind! I cried, much surprised.
Not only blind, continued the Professor, but absolutely without organs of sight.
I now examined our discovery for myself. It was singular, to be sure, but it was really a fact. This, however, might be a solitary instance, I suggested. The hook was baited again, and once more thrown into the water. This subterranean ocean must have been tolerably well supplied with fish, for in 2 hours we took a large number of pteryctis, as well as other fish belonging to another supposed extinct family, the Dipterides, a genus of fish furnished with 2 fins only, whence the name, though my uncle could not class it exactly. All, without exception, however, were blind. This unexpected capture enabled us to renew our stock of provisions in a very satisfactory way. We were now convinced that this subterranean sea contained only fish known to us as fossil specimens, and fish and reptiles alike were all the more perfect the farther back they dated their origin. We began to hope that we should find some of those saurians which science has succeeded in reconstructing from bits of bone and cartilage. I took up the telescope and carefully examined the horizon, looked over the whole sea. It was utterly and entirely deserted. Doubtless we were still too near the coast. After an examination of the ocean, I looked upward towards the strange and mysterious sky. Why should not one of the birds reconstructed by the immortal Cuvier flap his stupendous wings aloft in the dull strata of subterranean air? It would, of course, find quite sufficient food from the fish in the sea. I gazed for some time upon the void above. It was as silent and as deserted as the shores we had but lately left. Nevertheless, though I could neither see nor discover anything, my imagination carried me away into wild hypotheses. I was in a kind of waking dream. I thought I saw on the surface of the water those enormous antediluvian turtles, as big as floating islands. Upon those dull and somber shores passed a spectral row of the mammifers of early days, the great Leptotherium found in the cavernous hollow of the Brazilian hills, the Mesicotherium, a native of the glacial regions of Siberia. Farther on, the Pachydermatous Lophrodon, the gigantic tapir, which concealed itself behind rocks, ready to do battle for its prey with the Anoplotherium, a singular animal partaking of the nature of the rhinoceros, the horse, the hippopotamus, and the camel. There was the giant mastodon, twisting and turning his horrid trunk, with which he crushed the rocks of the shore to powder, while the megatherium, his back raised like a cat in a passion, his enormous claws stretched out, dug into the earth for food, at the same time that he awoke the sonorous echoes of the whole place with its terrible roar. Higher up still, the first monkey ever seen on the face of the globe clambered, gambolling and playing up the granite hills. Still farther away ran the pterodactyl with the winged hand, gliding or rather sailing through the dense and compressed air like a huge bat. Above all, near the leaden granitic sky, were immense birds, more powerful than the cassowary and the ostrich, which spread their mighty wings and fluttered against the huge stone vault of the inland sea. I thought, such was the effect of my imagination, that I saw this whole tribe of antediluvian creatures.
I carried myself back to far ages, long before man existed, when in fact the earth was in too imperfect a state for him to live upon it. My dream was of countless ages before the existence of man. The mammifers first disappeared, then the mighty birds, then the reptiles of the secondary period, presently the fish, the crustacea, the mollusks, and finally the vertebrata. The zoophytes of the period of transition in their turn sank into annihilation. The whole panorama of the world's life before the historic period seemed to be born over again, and mine was the only human heart that beat in this unpeopled world. There were no more seasons, there were no more climates, the natural heat of the world increased unceasingly, and neutralized that of the great radiant sun. Vegetation was exaggerated in an extraordinary manner. I passed like a shadow in the midst of brushwood as lofty as the giant trees of California, and trod underfoot the moist and humid soil, reeking with the rank and varied vegetation. I leaned against the huge column-like trunks of giant trees, to which those of Canada were as ferns. Whole ages passed, hundreds upon hundreds of years were concentrated into a single day. Next, unrolled before me like a panorama, came the great and wondrous series of terrestrial transformations. Plants disappeared, the granitic rocks lost all trace of solidity, the liquid state was suddenly substituted for that which had before existed. This was caused by intense heat acting on the organic matter of the earth. The waters flowed over the whole surface of the globe. They boiled, they were volatilized or turned into vapor. A kind of steam cloud wrapped the whole earth, the globe itself becoming at last nothing but one huge sphere of gas, indescribable in color, between white heat and red, as big and as brilliant as the sun. In the very center of this prodigious mass, 1,400,000 times as large as our globe, I was whirled round in space and brought into close conjunction with the planets. My body was subtilized, or rather become volatile, and commingled in a state of atomic vapor with the prodigious clouds, which rushed forward like a mighty comet into infinite space. What an extraordinary dream! Where would it finally take me? My feverish hand began to write down the marvelous details, details more like the imaginings of a lunatic than anything sober and real. I had during this period of hallucination forgotten everything, the professor, the guide, and the raft on which we were floating. My mind was in a state of semi-oblivion.
"What is the matter, Harry?" said my uncle suddenly.
My eyes, which were wide opened like those of a somnambulist, were fixed upon him, but I did not see him, nor could I clearly make out anything around me.
"Take care, my boy!" again cried my uncle. "You will fall into the sea."
As he uttered these words, I felt myself seized on the other side by the firm hand of our devoted guide. Had it not been for the presence of mind of Hans, I must infallibly have fallen into the waves and been drowned.
"Have you gone mad?" cried my uncle, shaking me on the other side.
What is the matter?" I said at last, coming to myself.
"Are you ill, Henry?"
continued the professor in an anxious tone. No, but I have had an extraordinary dream. It, however, has passed away. All now seems well," I added, looking around me with strangely puzzled eyes.
"All right," said my uncle. "A beautiful breeze, a splendid sea. We are going along at a rapid rate, and if I am not out in my calculations, we shall soon see land. I shall not be sorry to exchange the narrow limits of our raft for the mysterious strand of the subterranean ocean."
As my uncle uttered these words, I rose and carefully scanned the horizon. But the line of water was still confounded with the lowering clouds that hang aloft, and in the distance appeared to touch the edge of the water. End of chapter 29. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 30. Terrific Saurian Combat. Saturday, August 15th. The sea still retains its uniform monotony, the same leaden hue, the same eternal glare from above. No indication of land being in sight, the horizon appears to retreat before us, more and more as we advance. My head still dull and heavy from the effects of my extraordinary dream, which I cannot as yet banish from my mind. The Professor, who has not dreamt, is however in one of his morose and unaccountable humors, spends his time in scanning the horizon at every point of the compass. His telescope is raised every moment to his eyes, and when he finds nothing to give any clue to our whereabouts, he assumes a Napoleonic attitude and walks anxiously. I remarked that my uncle, the Professor, had a strong tendency to resume his old impatient character, and I could not but make a note of this disagreeable circumstance in my journal. I saw clearly that it had required all the influence of my danger and suffering to extract from him one scintillation of human feeling. Now that I was quite recovered, his original nature had conquered and obtained the upper hand. And after all, what had he to be angry and annoyed about, now more than at any other time? Was not the journey being accomplished under the most favorable circumstances? Was not the raft progressing with the most marvelous rapidity? What then could be the matter? After one or two preliminary hems, I determined to inquire. "You seem uneasy, uncle," said I, when for about the 100th time he put down his telescope and walked up and down, muttering to himself.
"No, I'm not uneasy," he replied in a dry, harsh tone. "By no means."
"Perhaps I should have said impatient," I replied, softening the force of my remark.
"Enough to make me so, I think."
"And yet we are advancing at a rate seldom attained by raft," I remarked.
"What matters that?" cried my uncle. "I'm not vexed at the rate we go at, but I am annoyed to find the sea so much vaster than I expected."
I then recollected that the Professor before our departure had estimated the length of this subterranean ocean as at most about 30 leagues. Now we had traveled at least over thrice that distance without discovering any trace of the distant shore. I began to understand my uncle's anger.
"We are not going down," suddenly exclaimed the Professor. "We are not progressing with our great discoveries. All this is utter loss of time. After all, I did not come from home to undertake a party of pleasure. This voyage on a raft over a pond annoys and wearies me."
He called this adventurous journey a party of pleasure, and this great inland sea a pond. "But," argued I, "if we have followed the route indicated by the great Saknussemm, we cannot be going far wrong."
"That is the question, as the great immortal Shakespeare has it. Are we following the route indicated by that wondrous sage? Did Saknussemm ever fall in with this great sheet of water? If he did he cross it? I begin to fear that the rivulet we adopted for a guide has led us wrong."
"In any case, we can never regret having come thus far. It is worth the whole journey to have enjoyed this magnificent spectacle. It is something to have seen."
"I care nothing about seeing, nor about magnificent spectacles. I came down into the interior of the earth with an object, and that object I mean to attain. Don't talk to me about admiring scenery, or any other sentimental trash."
After this I thought it well to hold my tongue, and allow the Professor to bite his lips until the blood came, without further remark.
At 6 o'clock in the evening our matter-of-fact guide Hans asked for his week's salary, and receiving his 3 rix dollars, put them carefully in his pocket. He was perfectly contented and satisfied. Sunday, August 16th. Nothing new to record. The same weather as before. The wind has a slight tendency to freshen up, with signs of an approaching gale. When I awoke, my first observation was in regard to the intensity of the light. I keep on fearing day after day that the extraordinary electric phenomenon should become first obscured and then go wholly out, leaving us in total darkness. Nothing, however, of the kind occurs. The shadow of the raft, its mast and sails, is clearly distinguished on the surface of the water. This wondrous sea is, after all, infinite in its extent. It must be quite as wide as the Mediterranean, or perhaps even as the great Atlantic Ocean. Why, after all, should it not be so? My uncle has on more than one occasion tried deep sea soundings. He tied the cross of one of our heaviest crowbars to the extremity of a cord, which he allowed to run out to the extent of 200 fathoms. We had the greatest difficulty in hoisting in our novel kind of lead. When the crowbar was finally dragged on board, Hans called my attention to some singular marks upon its surface. The piece of iron looked as if it had been crushed between two very hard substances. I looked at our worthy guide with an inquiring glance. "Tender," said he. Of course I was at a loss to understand. I turned round towards my uncle, absorbed in gloomy reflections. I had little wish to disturb him from his reverie. I accordingly turned once more towards our worthy Icelander. Hans very quietly and significantly opened his mouth once or twice, as if in the act of biting, and in this way made me understand his meaning. "Teeth!" cried I, with stupefaction, as I examined the bar of iron with more attention. Yes, there can be no doubt about the matter. The indentations on the bar of iron are the marks of teeth. What jaws must the owner of such molars be possessed of? Have we then come upon a monster of unknown species, which still exists within the vast waste of waters, a monster more voracious than a shark, more terrible and bulky than the whale? I am unable to withdraw my eyes from the bar of iron, actually half crushed. Is then my dream about to come true, a dread and terrible reality? All day my thoughts were bent upon these speculations, and my imagination scarcely regained a degree of calmness and power of reflection until after a sleep of many hours. This day, as on other Sundays, we observed as a day of rest and pious meditation. Monday, August 17th. I have been trying to realize from memory the particular instincts of those antediluvian animals of the secondary period, which, succeeding to the mollusca, to the crustacea, and to the fish, preceded the appearance of the race of mammifers. The generation of reptiles then reigned supreme upon the earth. These hideous monsters ruled everything in the seas of the secondary period, which formed the strata of which the Jura mountains are composed. Nature had endowed them with perfect organization. What a gigantic structure was theirs! What vast and prodigious strength they possessed! The existing saurians, which include all such reptiles as lizards, crocodiles, and alligators, even the largest and most formidable of their class, are but feeble imitations of their mighty sires, the animals of ages long ago. If there were giants in the days of old, there were also gigantic animals. I shuddered as I evolved from my mind the idea and recollection of these awful monsters. No eye of man had seen them in the flesh. They took their walks abroad upon the face of the earth thousands of ages before man came into existence, and their fossil bones, discovered in the limestone, have allowed us to reconstruct them anatomically, and thus to get some faint idea of their colossal formation. I recollect once seeing in the great museum of Hamburg the skeleton of one of these wonderful saurians. It measured no less than 30 feet from the nose to the tail. Am I, then, an inhabitant of the earth of the present day, destined to find myself face to face with a representative of this antediluvian family? I can scarcely believe it possible. I can hardly believe it true. And yet these marks of powerful teeth upon the bar of iron, can there be a doubt from their shape that the bite is the bite of a crocodile? My eyes stare wildly and with terror upon the subterranean sea. Every moment I expect one of these monsters to rise from its vast cavernous depth. I fancy that the worthy professor in some measure shares my notions, if not my fears, for after an attentive examination of the crowbar, he cast his eyes rapidly over the mighty and mysterious ocean. What could possess him to leave the land, I thought, as if the depth of this water was of any importance to us. No doubt he has disturbed some terrible monster in his watery home, and perhaps we may pay dearly for our temerity. Anxious to be prepared for the worst, I examined our weapons, and saw that they were in a fit state for use. My uncle looked on at me and nodded his head approvingly. He too has noticed what we have to fear. Already the uplifting of the waters on the surface indicates that something is in motion below. The danger approaches. It comes nearer and nearer. It behooves us to be on the watch. Tuesday, August 18th. Evening came at last, the hour when the desire for sleep caused our eyelids to be heavy. Night there is not, properly speaking, in this place, any more than there is in summer in the Arctic regions. Hans, however, is immovable at the rudder. When he snatches a moment of rest, I really cannot say. I take advantage of his vigilance to take some little repose. But 2 hours after, I was awakened from a heavy sleep by an awful shock. The raft appeared to have struck upon a sunken rock. It was lifted right out of the water by some wondrous and mysterious power, and then started off 20 fathoms distant.
What is it? Cried my uncle, starting up. Are we shipwrecked, or what?
Hans raised his hand and pointed to where, about 200 yards off, a large black mass was moving up and down. I looked with awe. My worst fears were realized. "It is a colossal monster!" I cried, clasping my hands.
Yes, cried the agitated professor, and there yonder is a huge sea lizard of terrible size and shape.
And farther on, behold a prodigious crocodile. Look at his hideous jaws and that row of monstrous teeth. Ha, he has gone.
A whale, shouted the professor. I can see her enormous fins. See how she blows air and water.
2 liquid columns rose to a vast height above the level of the sea, into which they fell with a terrific crash, waking up the echoes of that awful place. We stood still, surprised, stupefied, terror-stricken at the sight of this group of fearful marine monsters, more hideous in the reality than in my dream. They were of supernatural dimensions. The very smallest of the whole party could with ease have crushed our raft and ourselves with a single bite. Hans, seizing the rudder, which had flown out of his hand, puts it hard aweather in order to escape from such dangerous vicinity. But no sooner does he do so than he finds he is flying from Scylla to Charybdis. To leeward is a turtle about 40 feet wide, and a serpent quite as long, with an enormous and hideous head peering from out of the waters. Look which way we will, it is impossible for us to fly. The fearful reptiles advanced upon us. They turned and twisted about the raft
with awful rapidity. They formed around our devoted vessel a series of concentric circles. I took up my rifle in desperation. But what effect can a rifle ball produce upon the armor scales with which these bodies of these horrid monsters are covered? We remain still and dumb from utter horror. They advance upon us, nearer and nearer. Our fate appears certain, fearful and terrible. On one side the mighty crocodile, on the other the great sea serpent. The rest of the fearful crowd of marine prodigies have plunged beneath the briny waves and disappeared. I am about to fire at any risk and try the effect of a shot. Hans, the guide, however, interfered by a sign to check me. The two hideous and ravenous monsters passed within 50 fathoms of the raft, and then made a rush at one another, their fury and rage preventing them from seeing us. The combat commenced. We distinctly made out every action of the two hideous monsters. But to my excited imagination, the other animals appeared about to take part in the fierce and deadly struggle. The monster, the whale, the lizard, and the turtle. I distinctly saw them every moment. I pointed them out to the Icelander, but he only shook his head. Två, he said. What? Two only, does he say? Surely he is mistaken, I cried in a tone of wonder.
He is quite right, replied my uncle coolly and philosophically,
examining the terrible duel with his telescope, and speaking as if he were in a lecture room. How can that be?
Yes, it is so. The first of these hideous monsters has the snout of a porpoise, the head of a lizard, the teeth of a crocodile, and it is this that has deceived us. It is the most fearful of all antediluvian reptiles, the world-renowned Ichthyosaurus, or great fish lizard.
And the other?
The other is a monstrous serpent concealed under the hard vaulted shell of the turtle, the terrible enemy of its fearful rival, the Plesiosaurus, or sea crocodile.
Hans was quite right. The two monsters only disturbed the surface of the sea. At last have mortal eyes gazed upon two reptiles of the great primitive ocean. I see the flaming red eyes of the Ichthyosaurus, each as big or bigger than a man's head. Nature, in its infinite wisdom, had gifted this wondrous marine animal with an optical apparatus of extreme power, capable of resisting the pressure of the heavy layers of water which rolled over him in the depths of the ocean where he usually fed. It has by some authors truly been called the whale of the saurian race, for it is as big and quick in its motions as our king of the seas. This one measures not less than 100 feet in length, and I can form some idea of his girth when I see him lift his prodigious tail out of the waters. His jaw is of awful size and strength, and according to the best informed naturalists, it does not contain less than 182 teeth. The other was the mighty Plesiosaurus, a serpent with a cylindrical trunk, with a short stumpy tail, with fins like a bank of oars in a Roman galley. Its whole body covered by a carapace or shell, and its neck, as flexible as that of a swan, rose more than 30 feet above the waves, a tower of animated flesh. These animals attacked one another with inconceivable fury. Such a combat was never seen before by mortal eyes, and to us who did see it, it appeared more like the phantasmagoric creation of a dream than anything else. They raised mountains of water, which dashed in spray over the raft, already tossed to and fro by the waves. 20 times we seemed on the point of being upset and hurled headlong into the waves. Hideous hisses appeared to shake the gloomy granite roof of that mighty cavern, hisses which carried terror to our hearts. The awful combatants held each other in a tight embrace. I could not make out one from the other.
Still the combat could not last for ever, and woe unto us whichsoever became the victor. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours passed away without any decisive result. The struggle continued with the same deadly tenacity, but without apparent result. The deadly opponents now approached, now drew away from the raft. Once or twice we fancied they were about to leave us altogether, but instead of that they came nearer and nearer. We crouched on the raft, ready to fire at them at a moment's notice, poor as the prospect of hurting or terrifying them was. Still we were determined not to perish without a struggle. Suddenly the ichthyosaurus and the plesiosaurus disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind them a maelstrom in the midst of the sea. We were nearly drawn down by the indraft of the water. Several minutes elapsed before anything was again seen. Was this wonderful combat to end in the depths of the ocean? Was the last act of this terrible drama to take place without spectators? It was impossible for us to say. Suddenly, at no great distance from us, an enormous mass rises out of the waters, the head of the great plesiosaurus. The terrible monster is now wounded unto death. I can see nothing now of his enormous body. All that could be distinguished was his serpent-like neck, which he twisted and curled in all the agonies of death. Now he struck the waters with it as if it had been a gigantic whip, and then again wriggled like a worm cut in two. The water was spurted up to a great distance in all directions. A great portion of it swept over our raft and nearly blinded us. But soon the end of the beast approached nearer and nearer. His movements slackened visibly. His contortions almost ceased, and at last the body of the mighty snake lay an inert, dead mass on the surface of the now calm and placid waters. As for the ichthyosaurus, had he gone down to his mighty cavern under the sea to rest, or will he reappear to destroy us? This question remained unanswered, and we had breathing time. End of chapter 30. Read by Lars Rolander.